A blizzard of snow swirled in a frantic dance, hitting the walls of the gloomy castle. Opposite the window there was a table on which, in a small plate, there was a sandwich made of 2 pieces of stale loaf and jam. Approaching him, the young girl took out a box of matches from the pocket of her dress and lit one. Taking a plate of food and blowing out a match, Honey wished herself a happy birthday. She was alone in this castle and desperately trying to survive, and today she turned 19. But even now, on this day, other people outside hoped that the girl would die. That day was firmly planted in her head and left deep spiritual wounds in her heart. Emperor Frederick then ordered Honey to be moved to MacLeod Castle, but the people around considered this punishment too merciful, remembering how her mother tried to poison the Empress. In addition, they had lost the imperial grandson she was carrying. Therefore, the people began to beg His Majesty to revoke the order and reconsider the severity of the punishment. With a twinkle in his eyes, Frederick ordered everyone to shut their mouths immediately, promising that otherwise they would go with Honey to the castle. Being imprisoned in MacLeod's ice castle was tantamount to a death sentence. Frederick reduced it to the best substitute for his sister's death sentence, although she did nothing at all. The castle, around which eternal winter stands, was located on the top of a snowy mountain. This mountain, which used to be full of greenery, froze over about 500 years ago. At that time, the then emperor defeated a dragon that possessed ice magic. As the emperor's sword pierced the dragon's heart, an incredible power burst out. It froze the mountain in an instant, resulting in the freezing of nearby villages and hundreds of victims. Even after 500 years, the forest has not changed its appearance, preserving the horror of that incident as if it were yesterday. But it wasn't enough that Honey had been banished there. She had somehow absorbed the dragon's power, to her horror. The girl sat on the floor doomedly, considering her life simply terrible, and if God existed, He would never tolerate this. She didn't know what else to expect from a life in which not even a drop of warmth could be felt. Putting her hand on her heart, the heroine began to cry, believing that people cannot live without warmth. And now, the only thing she had, she decided to commit her first sin. After creating several ice spears in the air, the girl closed her eyes and prepared herself. A second later, lying in a pool of her own blood, she felt a pleasant warmth for the first time. And if there really was someone who heard her in this place, then Honey only wanted to be born in a place that was not so cold. Suddenly, the heroine opened her eyes and found herself on the bed, jumping up and clutching her head with her hands. Hanya's mother, Eleanor, was standing in front of the bed, shouting furiously at her daughter, considering her a useless fool. The heroine thought that perhaps these were the dying flashes of the past, but then why this particular moment? Continuing to rage, the woman went to the table and took the girl's music box. After smashing it on the floor, she decided that known entities like Honey should not have been born in the first place. The heroine sighed bitterly, still not understanding why she had to see this. The mother shouted that every time she saw her daughter, it seemed to her that she was walking in hellfire. Eleanor was a former empress who was not satisfied with even this status and soon fell into decadence. After Frederick's ascension to the throne, the woman found herself in a dead end and began to take out all her anger on the baby. As a child, Honey believed that she was to blame for everything, so she kept her mouth shut and endured without making a sound. And now, once she was here again, she realized how stupid she had been. Seeing her daughter think about something, Eleanor became even more furious. Coming close to her, her mother furiously rolled her eyes, mad with anger. Punching Honey in the face, she was shocked that even such a creature would consider her a laughingstock. At this moment, the girl was very surprised to feel pain in her cheek after the blow. Beginning to doubt that she was really dead, the heroine suddenly felt a familiar power in her heart. Looking at her hand, she saw a blue glow that gently enveloped her palm. Realizing that she had gone back in time and possessed ice magic, Honey was shocked. Eleanor stood behind, staring furiously at the girl, who didn't even pay attention to her. Then the woman concluded that even such a scum as her daughter looked down on her. Looking around, Honey thought that if this was her payback, then she was too cruel. Meanwhile, a little boy with golden hair and eyes was walking along the royal palace. Looking to the side, his gaze fell on something that confused him. Not long before, Honey recalled how the maids brought a music box given to her by His Majesty. Eleanor thought that Frederick had gone mad to give something to the princess. In front of the girl, she put this box on the table in her room. After waiting for the night and making sure that everyone was asleep, Honey quietly crept to the gift. Turning on the box, she enjoyed pleasant sounds that she had never heard since birth. And now, this gift was shattered, right in front of the girl. His mother ordered him to sit silently in her room until the wounds healed, and if Hani even put a finger on the threshold, she would blame herself. However, Eleanor was sure that even if her daughter wanted to, she would not have the courage to leave the room. After that, she began to leave the room, leaving the girl alone with her thoughts. Honey couldn't understand why she had endured it and why she was still enduring it. Calmly leaving the room, Eleanor suddenly noticed the princess sneak past her. At the same moment, Honey gave her mother a sharp push, causing her to fall and hurt herself. While the woman and her servants were recovering from the shock, the girl ran along the corridors calling for help. A few seconds later, Honey heard her mother scream behind her, ordering her to be caught. The wounds on the princess's body still hurt, and the girl did not know where to run. She remembered that when she lived on the snowy mountain, the emperor was the only one who provided her with everything she needed. Realizing that only he could help her now, Honey turned in the direction of Frederick's chambers. But suddenly, women's arms grabbed her from all sides, terrifying the heroine. The maids were glad that they had finally caught the escaped princess and intended to take her to her mistress. One of them was shocked by how fast the girl could run, even in such a state. The baby wanted to scream for help, but her mouth was abruptly covered with her hand. Another maid reminded her that if Hani was obedient, then Her Highness, the former empress, would forgive her. The heroine understood that if they took her away now, it would definitely be the end. For a second, the thought of freezing the maids with her ability arose in the girl's mind, but she immediately cut herself off, not wanting to become a monster even though she possesses its power. She began to scream again, but the girls covered her mouth and began to forcibly take her back. Suddenly, Honey saw a little boy around the corner, with golden hair and eyes, who was shocked by what she saw. It was Oswald, the son of the current emperor, who could report everything to his father. However, he did not move in terror, and the maids continued to drag the girl back to the room. Struggling with the last of her strength, Honey tried to scream and ask for help, but it was all in vain. She could only hope that the boy understood everything correctly and immediately reported everything to his father. Completely exhausted, the heroine almost hung in the arms of the girls, looking at Oswald pleadingly. The boy looked back at her, completely confused by what was happening. The maids reported to the mistress that everything was quiet and they did not bump into anyone. Eleanor didn't care who was sticking her nose here because Frederick would never get what was happening here anyway. She looked furiously at her daughter, whose attempts were in vain. Most of all, the woman was annoyed that this bastard dared to push her and run away. She decided to ask if Honey had the courage to contradict her. In this case, it was necessary to show the baby her place again, after which the woman took her daughter's head with her hands. But suddenly, the screams of the maids were heard that the imperial knights were standing outside, causing Eleanor to be stunned. The main character immediately realized that the boy had told his father about everything. Pretty frightened, the woman began to think convulsively, ordering to quickly clean up the room. The baby, having tied up, was put in the closet, sealing her mouth with adhesive tape. One of the maids was ordered to guard the girl so that there would not be a single squeak from her. Turning to Honey, Eleanor ordered her to pretend to be dead, as they still had something to discuss. After that, she closed the doors of the closet, leaving the baby in the dark, and hurried to the knights. Finally arriving at the place, the knights, led by Captain Drake, greeted Her Highness. Drake was especially pleased to learn that the former empress was doing well. As it turns out, Emperor Frederick ordered a check on how Her Highness Princess Hani is doing. Eleanor chuckled, not remembering when she and the emperor had become so close that they could pay each other visits. However, the captain was not interested in this because he was only carrying out His Majesty's orders. The woman pretended to understand his intentions, but now was not the time because the princess was sleeping after a lesson in etiquette. Drake was perplexed because did the lady really want to disobey the order of the emperor? Eleanor was outraged that they were asking to wake up the little princess just to have her show up in front of them. The soldiers asked for forgiveness, for it was His Majesty's order, but the woman did not let them finish. Eleanor began to shout in fury that since she was no longer the empress, then didn't her words matter anymore? She refused to show the child until Emperor Frederick personally came here to do so. Honey heard everything from the closet and prayed to God for some miracle. Apologizing for bothering him, Drake and his men were forced to bow out. From these words, goosebumps ran down the back of the tied girl. After all, if the knights just left now, then the princess's life would be no better than before. Suddenly, the corridor was filled with the thunderous voice of the emperor, who did not understand what the noise was. Expecting such behavior from the former empress, Frederick decided to come himself. Drake greeted His Highness with a bow, apologizing for not being able to figure it out himself. Eleanor did not understand why such a busy man would visit them. After all, if he wanted to inquire about the health of the princess, he could have chosen another day, but the emperor refused. After all, he had come here to see his younger sister, and what other reason was needed for that? The girl heard him demand to see Princess Honey to him immediately. Trying to dissuade herself, Eleanor was shocked by Frederick's insistence, who had never come in the last 9 years. Therefore, now, he must have had a good reason to insist on waking up the sleeping child. To the woman's horror, it turned out that the emperor had received a report that the princess had been forcibly dragged somewhere by her own maids. Looking surprised, Eleanor pretended not to understand His Majesty's words. The maids also pretended to hear about such a thing for the first time and did not understand anything. But Frederick only laughed in response, because he did not expect that all the workers participated in the conspiracy. At the same moment, he gave the order to search the palace and find Her Highness, Princess Honey. The woman began to scream in horror, not understanding how it was possible to make such a fuss because of some rumors. However, the young Crown Prince Oswald considered the words of the former empress to be fundamentally wrong. After all, these were not rumors at all, and he personally saw the incident. Eleanor froze in amazement and fear, and Frederick became indignant at his son, who had been ordered to wait and not interfere. But Oswald believed that since he was the first to see everything, he must certainly observe to the very end. The woman glared fiercely at the titled bastard who dared to open his mouth. The emperor gave Eleanor one last chance to confess herself before the knights found the baby. However, the woman persistently pretended that she did not know anything, which made Frederick furious. The former empress was determined to remain silent until the very end, no matter what happened. Moreover, looking helpless, she didn't understand why the emperor was doing this to her. Suddenly, Oswald ordered the knight to open a cabinet in the corner of the room, thinking that the girl might be there. Eleanor looked at him in horror, frozen in place, and felt an icy chill of fear. Hearing all that was happening, Hani looked hopefully at the closed door, waiting for her rescuers. Suddenly, in the darkness of the space inside the closet, a thin ray of light shone throughout. Opening the door completely, everyone present saw a terrible picture of a frightened and tied-up baby. Oswald happily held out his hand to her, joyfully greeting the girl who had nothing more to fear. First of all, he got rid of the fetters that hurt her and took her to her father. Hanny couldn't believe her eyes as she finally came face to face with the emperor. However, now, she firmly decided that it was time to stop hesitating and start acting. Falling on her knees before Frederick, the girl began to beg the emperor to protect her from her mother's attacks. Eleanor looked at her daughter dumbfounded, not understanding how she could do this to her own mother. This sight was enough for the emperor to understand everything and become furious. First of all, he ordered the immediate arrest of the offender, as well as all her maids. Keeping her eyes on Frederick, Honey heard the screams of the girls behind her, towards whom the knights were heading. Suddenly, Oswald came up to the baby and gently took her hand, greatly embarrassing the heroine. Making sure that the criminals were tied up, the emperor turned to the children. He wanted them to follow him together, leaving everything else to the knights. As soon as the girl breathed a sigh of relief, she suddenly heard her mother's frantic scream. Eleanor was shaking in a frenzy, wondering if her punishment wasn't enough. She immediately began to hurl insults at her daughter, when suddenly Drake covered her mouth with his hand. Frederick was glad to finally see the true face of this woman, who had apparently completely lost her fear. And since she herself wanted to, the emperor ordered the captain to conduct a strict interrogation of Eleanor. Turning to the children, he realized that they were probably already in shock, wanting to get away from them as soon as possible. After that, he stretched out his hand to Honey, intending to pat her on the head. Frightened, the girl jerked her head, covering it with her hands and closing her eyes. Seeing this, Frederick repented of his carelessness and asked his sister's forgiveness. He didn't want to hurt her at all, and as proof, he threw his imperial cloak over Hani. Realizing that she had gone through a lot, the emperor expressed a desire to carry the girl in his arms. Honey, shocked, nodded hesitantly, and immediately found herself in His Highness's arms. After that, he called his son, who was smiling sweetly, looking at the heroine. His father admired his bravery, but now they will need to talk about the boy's reckless walks. Honey received help, but all this warmth emanating from the emperor was so unfamiliar. Until now, she had withered alone in the ice palace. And now, was it really all happening in reality? Her thoughts were interrupted by Oswald, who wondered if everything was all right with the girl. Looking into his worried eyes, the heroine felt for the first time a manifestation of care for her. Burying herself in Frederick's vest in embarrassment, she awkwardly agreed that she was fine. She believed with all her heart that these kind glances did not turn out to be just a fleeting dream. And now, most of all, she wanted to soak up this warmth a little more. After a short time, the emperor with his sister and son safely reached the palace. The head butler, Charles, accompanied by his servants, greeted His Highness, the son of the empire. At the same moment, the man's gaze fell on the wounded girl in the emperor's arms. Looking carefully at the little girl, he immediately thought that he should call the imperial healer. Nodding in agreement, Frederick also wanted to know where the empresses were now. Learning that they were both in the living room, the emperor ordered the princess to be brought there after all the procedures. And for this time, he decided to entrust her to the personal servant of the palace, a young girl, Viola. Gently taking the princess in her arm, the maid greeted her and invited her to come with her. Seeing this, Oswald began to beg his father to let him go with Honey. Having agreed, Frederick understood that it would be difficult to get used to the relationship of these two. After all, at first glance they looked like two children, but Honey was Oswald's aunt. Looking after them, the emperor informed Charles that for some time the palace would be restless. He thought that Eleanor was hiding the girl out of excessive care, but it turned out to be much worse. Later, when he came to the living room, Frederick was greeted by his mother, Constance, and wife, Melissa. Both empresses were very worried, as they could not find Oswald anywhere. However, instead of explaining, the emperor wanted to discuss something with them. Meanwhile, Viola has led the children to a room where the princess will be seen by a doctor a little later. Sitting on a chair, Honey looked in the mirror and concluded that she was now about 9 years old. She remembered the shattered music box that she had secretly turned on when everyone was asleep. At those moments, the girl imagined growing up in a happy family, in love and harmony, just like Oswald, whose parents took care of their son and took care of him. Suddenly, Honey saw the boy's gaze, which was directed at her wounds. A little embarrassed, she apologized to him, leaving the crown prince in a stupor. Oswald wondered if the heroine had done something wrong. The girl was sure that he was amazed to see something he shouldn't have seen. Then, instead of apologizing, the boy demanded gratitude from his aunt for saving him. These were the words of his mother, and he, being an obedient and kind son, remembered them well. The heroine was a little embarrassed by such words, looking carefully at Oswald. Blushing and covering her mouth with her hand, she hesitantly but sincerely thanked the hero for saving her. The boy's face changed abruptly, acquiring an expression of excited delight. Looking at him, Honey thought that if the light gathered and became a human, it would surely look like this. Suddenly, there was a knock on their door, and a woman's voice asked for permission to enter. Oswald gave his consent, and Agnes, who was the imperial physician, entered their room. The heroine could hardly believe that she was able to see one of the 3 best doctors of the empire live. In a past life, it was Agnes who saved the empress who was poisoned by Eleanor. To the doctor's deepest regret, His Highness had to leave this room. This was necessary for the procedure, and she hoped for the crown prince's understanding. Going out the door with Viola, Oswald asked Agnes not to offend the heroine. Sitting opposite the baby and putting on gloves, the healer began to examine her hands. An ordinary child would have burst out and cried in pain, but Honey only winced slightly. Greatly surprised, Agnes thought that this was how the girl coped with all the difficulties. When they finished, the princess's hands were completely bandaged. Suddenly, the girl wondered if she needed to show the scars under her clothes, which shocked the doctor. Honey knew that the girl needed to report her condition to His Highness. Agnes wondered how the little girl knew about her mission, but the girl just guessed. However, she was very grateful to the emperor, who was worried about her and saved her from her mother's arms. Honey decided that for the good of her future, she needed to show all the scars left by her life in the palace. Agnes sat in a half-shocked state, looking at the princess's shaking hands. The girl hesitantly began to take off the buttons of her dress, barely coping with the trembling. Unable to stand it, the girl grabbed her hands, confusing the heroine. But the healer only wanted to help the young princess, to take off her clothes. After examining the scars on Her Highness's body, Agnes wrote in a report that the princess was regularly abused. After receiving the necessary help, the girl finally came out to Oswald and Viola, who were waiting for her. The boy immediately wanted to know how all the procedures went and whether she was okay. Most of all, he wanted to know if the healer had hurt the girl. Then Honey calmed him down, because thanks to him, she did not hurt at all. For Oswald, this was the most important thing, and he suggested that he immediately go to his father. Entering the living room, the heroine immediately felt the incredible heaviness of the atmosphere in the air. This was not surprising, because the emperor had probably already told the empresses everything. Sitting down on the sofa, the girl only wanted to know if everyone really believed her. First of all, Frederick admitted that they had already read Agnes's report on her condition. Therefore, the emperor wanted to personally express his gratitude for the bravery of the little girl. Since he was there in person, there was no need for an investigation, but evidence was needed to strip Eleanor of the title. Melissa decided to intervene in her husband's speech, believing that they had gathered here to listen to the princess. The empress wanted the girl to tell them about everything that had happened to her. Pulling herself together, the heroine told them about all the suffering caused by her mother, which discouraged her from living. Living every day in oppression, she could not stand it anymore and decided to run away, but she was caught. Frederick was furious at what he heard, not understanding why the little girl did not immediately ask for help. But then he came to his senses, because it was they who had to find out everything themselves. The heroine remembered how her mother called her a disgusting monster that no one loves and will not help. And even if Hani told the emperor everything, it would be in vain, because she was the daughter of his nemesis. That is why the heroine could not ask for help, which led Frederick to a stupor. Constance clutched her head, shocked by what she heard. The emperor began to reproach himself for not suspecting anything when Eleanor's maids lied to his face. Now, he barely considered himself worthy of apologizing for not understanding everything earlier. Oswald ran over and hugged Honey tightly, tearfully pronouncing her name. He did not consider her a monster at all. On the contrary, he called those who had hurt her that way. But now, he resolutely promised the princess that she would no longer feel pain. Unable to stand it, the girl burst into tears right on his shoulder, feeling protected. Melissa sat down next to them and hugged them tightly, fully supporting her son's words. Looking at the girl, the empress realized that it was incredibly difficult for her to cope alone. Constance decided that it was time to stop being lenient with Eleanor because of her child. Everyone agreed with this, and now it was necessary to choose the punishment to which the woman would be subjected. At this moment, the children safely fell asleep on the couch, having experienced an emotional shock. After a while, Honey opened her eyes and found herself on a soft bed in an unfamiliar room. At the same time, at the other end of the bed, Oswald, who had also recently woken up, was stretching sweetly. The princess found out from him that they were now in his father's chamber. Suddenly, Honey noticed that the boy's eyes were very swollen. Oswald only smiled in response, because the baby's eyes were no better. There was a short pause in the air, after which the heroes laughed heartily. The girl felt as if she had just woken up at the end of a long winter. New shoots bloomed outside the window, symbolizing the onset of the long-awaited spring. Meanwhile, in the dungeon, the guard tried to calm down the talking maids accused of assisting Eleanor. They considered themselves innocent, thinking that they were only fulfilling the will of the mistress. One of them, in tears, was ready to tell in detail about everything that had happened. Next to the guard stood Frederick, who was disgusted by the distant camera. In it sat Her Highness, the former Empress Eleanor, silently lowering her head. All the maids claimed cruelty on her part, so the emperor wanted to hear the opinion of the woman herself. But she said nothing, only occasionally glancing at Frederick with the eyes of a maniac. The news of Eleanor's bullying spread like a fire throughout the palace and beyond. Frederick understood that given her status as a former empress, she would still become the center of everyone's attention. However, you will need a good reason to deprive her of her status and subject her to the appropriate punishment. But most of all, the emperor was worried about Hani's reaction to this situation. So he invited the girl to his office, and she came, accompanied by Oswald. Looking at the girl attentively, Frederick wanted to tell her something. Folding his hands, the emperor admitted that he was going to subject Eleanor to death. The girl was surprised to hear the same sentence that was passed on her mother in a previous life. At that time, the woman made an unsuccessful attempt to poison the emperor's mother, Constantia. When this happened, Eleanor and her daughter were imprisoned in a separate palace where they lived all this time. However, later the woman tried to poison Melissa, and this time successfully, after which she was sentenced to death. And her daughter Honey was imprisoned in an ice palace on a snowy mountain, where she lived the rest of her life. Now Eleanor's punishment was as severe as then, but because of the girl. Seeing her gaze, Frederick hastened to clarify that the baby was not at all to blame for all this. After all, her mother had already tried to poison Constance, so it was time to be held accountable. The heroine understood that the emperor was worried about her, fearing that she would blame herself for her mother's death. But Honey had been preparing for it since her arrival here and felt no guilt at all. Therefore, looking confidently at His Highness, she admitted that she was perfectly fine. Frederick was surprised by such a decisive answer and look which is not characteristic of a child. Then he admitted that the woman was deprived of her status, and the execution would take place in 2 days. Then the little girl wondered if her mother admitted that she had abused her. As it turned out, Eleanor denied everything, considering herself completely innocent. The maidservants were also exposed, accusing one another, hoping to save themselves in this way. They too would be severely punished, and upon hearing this, Hani decided to follow His Majesty's order. Bowing, she was infinitely grateful to the emperor for saving her. Then Frederick ordered his head to be raised, for he had done only what he should have done long ago. He was surprised that, although she and Oswald were the same age, the girl seemed so grown up. Thinking about it, he remembered that his son still refers to the heroine by her first name. Despite the fact that they were the same age, Honey was Frederick's sister, which meant that Oswald should call her aunt. However, the boy was against it, wanting them to address each other by their first names. His father did not mind, but he wanted the boy to ask permission from the princess herself. Looking at her with shining eyes, he hoped that Her Highness would not refuse him. After all, as it turned out, almost no one addresses him by name, calling him Crown Prince. Only a few had the right to call him by his first name, and Honey was one of them, so Oswald hoped to get consent. Squinting at the bright light coming from the boy, the heroine decided that he could do anything. Hearing her consent and seeing the joyful face of his son, Frederick laughed. Without holding back his emotions, Oswald pounced on the girl, wrapping her in a warm embrace. 2 days later, the day of execution finally came, and during this time, the children were sitting in the room and reading books. According to Charles, His Highness ordered that the heroes be forbidden to leave the palace until the end of the event. Of course, a normal adult will not allow children to look at such a terrible sight. Therefore, although the heroine was depressed by this, she understood that it was right. But suddenly, abruptly slamming the book shut, Oswald invited Honey to follow him. On her face was written the desire to see the execution of this woman. And although they were not allowed to go to the place of execution, the little crown prince knew one loophole. Stretching out his hand to the baby, the hero hoped that she would be able to trust him. Deciding to think about the consequences later, Honey agreed and gave her hand in return. Quietly opening the door, the children carefully left and went unnoticed to the exit. Suddenly, a man's voice came from behind him, who was surprised to see them here. It was Captain Drake of the Knights, who was also the Emperor's right-hand man. However, as it turned out, Oswald knew perfectly well that the captain would certainly be there. And now the boy wanted Drake to personally lead them to the palace gates. Of course, the captain refused, but it was not a gratuitous request. After all, the Crown Prince was aware of how 6 months ago Drake had broken his father's favorite vase. But everyone thought that it was Melissa, and from these words the captain was horrified. The boy had heard about it in a conversation between him and the Empress when he happened to be passing by. Oswald's mother made this vase herself as a gift to her father, and he would not have let such an incident go even to his right hand. And Drake also tried to hide behind the Empress, which took the captain even more aback. After that, the captain of the Knights looked at the children with a pleading look. The girl also made this look, wanting to quietly look at the execution from afar. The young captain was surprised at how desperately the young princess asked. A little later, the yardmaids, who were in the courtyard, heard footsteps behind them and turned around. They were surprised to see Drake carrying the children in his arms, knowing that they were forbidden to leave the palace. Oswald was grateful to him, in return promising to keep their secret secret. At about the same time, the 2nd Divisional Detachment of Knights led the criminals, escorting them to the scaffold. Suddenly, the heroes heard the voice of the Emperor, who did not understand what they were doing here. He remembered exactly how he gave the order not to let the children out, so he waited for an explanation from the captain. In a stupor, Drake sweated and hesitantly tried to say something. At the same moment, the 2nd Division began to greet the son of the Empire, His Majesty Frederica. Eleanor was surprised to hear that the Emperor was nearby and looked in his direction. Suddenly, she saw her daughter, who was calmly standing and looking at the woman. Frightened, Frederick covered the baby with his body with lightning speed, confusing her. At the same moment, curses and insults poured from Eleanor's lips towards the girl. The woman did not believe that the imperial family would love her after she betrayed her own mother. Now, Eleanor knew for sure that she should get rid of such an ungrateful monster right away. Listening to threats and insults, the heroine suddenly realized that these words no longer frightened her. Looking at her broken and unhappy mother, Hani could not believe that she had suffered so much because of her. It was this woman's reaction that was the reason why the Emperor did not want them to meet. He immediately ordered the warrior to continue his march to the scaffold and remove this bastard from their sight. However, Eleanor suddenly sat down on the ground, sending the knights into a stupor. Biting one of the soldiers on the hand, she demanded that she be released immediately. The other knights forcibly dragged her further, listening to endless curses in Hanya's direction. The woman cursed her daughter, believing that one day she would be disposed of as unnecessary garbage. And she was glad that Honey would see the execution, because according to Eleanor, the girl was waiting for the same death. At the same moment, Drake gagged her with a rag, leaving everyone in a stupor. He did not understand. Had the soldiers forgotten how to shut up mad criminals? Holding Honey's hand, Oswald wanted her not to take her mother's words to heart. The girl looked at the crown prince in surprise, confused and not knowing what to say. But gathering her courage, she resolutely stated that no more words of this woman would hurt her. Eleanor looked at the girl in shock, who said goodbye to her in a calm voice. Hanny stood there until her mother passed through the main gate and disappeared from sight. As her figure decreased with each step, so did the emotions of the heroine. Frederick felt that the Second Templar should return to training again, and Drake volunteered to pass it on to him. However, in the opinion of the Emperor, the captain was no exception, with which he doomedly agreed. Honey was worried about him, but Oswald was calm, knowing his father's leniency towards Drake. The Emperor then reminded them that this was not the time to worry about others. He was also eager to hear excuses from the children who had violated the order. Hearing that they needed to get ready, Honey immediately closed her eyes, thinking that she was about to be hit. But Frederick approached her, gently shook her head, and then stepped aside. After sending the children with Drake to the palace, the Emperor headed for the gates going to be executed. Honey stared after him for a moment, rubbing her hand over the part of his head he had stroked. Returning to the palace, the children began to eat sweets on both cheeks, and Oswald offered the heroine a cookie. Honey still couldn't believe that all this was really happening to her. Even to think that she had come back from the dead and everything was going so well seemed strange. As she sank into her thoughts, she did not notice Oswald gently taking her hand. Coming out of her trance, Honey looked at the crown prince, hoping that it wasn't all in vain. Seeing the heroine's distant gaze, the boy decided to find out what was tormenting her. As it turned out, she was simply not completely sure that all this was not a dream. Therefore, Honey did not want to bother Oswald, believing that she just needed to get used to it. Then, with a resolute look, the crown prince decided that the girl needed to always remember something, namely, that they were a family, and Oswald loved the heroine very much. Honey was surprised that the boy called her family, but he was firm in his words. Therefore, she had nothing to worry about, because all the fears in her head would never come true. Not sure that she deserved such an attitude, the little girl decided to clarify whether he really considers her family. This question made Oswald laugh because they had been a family since birth. However, seeing her reaction, the hero thought that perhaps it was upsetting Honey. But everything was the other way around, and the heroine felt truly happy from his words. Suddenly, Charles walked through the door, greeting the children and hoping that they had a good rest. The butler hoped to borrow Sir Drake from them for a while, wanting to talk to him about something. Hearing their whispering outside the door, the children thought that the conversation would probably be about execution. After a short time, Drake finally returned to them with a very puzzled expression on his face. As it turned out, the execution ceremony was over and His Majesty would soon have to return to the palace. From his face, the heroine understood that the captain was not saying something, but decided not to specify. However, she decided to apologize to Sir Drake for the unnecessary trouble. Smiling and kneeling, the captain sincerely asked him to always address him by name. In addition, there was no need to apologize, because the deal was fair, and now they had to keep his secret. Smiling from the top of her mouth, the girl promised not to even stutter about his secret. When the emperor returns, the captain will go to haul sandbags at the training grounds. As for the children, they will have to take on Frederick's wrath, but Oswald decided to protect Honey. But the heroine did not want this at all, believing that she should take responsibility, along with everyone else. Then, seeing her determination, the crown prince decided to offer the girls something that could help. Drake watched in amazement as the two children whispered about something with a very important air. The heroine was shocked by what she heard, but Oswald believed that only she could cope with it. And if you do everything as he said, then the father will definitely not be able to scold and punish so much. However, Honey didn't see much point in this, biting her lip nervously. Just at that moment, a maid came and invited the children to an audience with the king. The heroes were taken aback by such a rapid development of events, frozen in place. The emperor was waiting in his study, looking at those who entered with an intimidating look. He hoped that Oswald and Honey would at least try to apologize for disobeying orders. The atmosphere was oppressive, and swallowing her saliva, the girl stepped forward. First of all, she admitted that she just wanted to see her mother with her own eyes for the last time. Honey thought that only this would help her truly realize that she was finally free from cruelty and violence. Now came the moment of which Oswald had spoken, and the crown prince gave her a sign to act. Folding her hands and rounding her eyes, the girl thought that perhaps the emperor was going to punish her. A strong tension hung in the air, from which the heroine could not even move. Frederick's stern face showed that the idea had failed miserably. But suddenly the emperor decided not to scold the children, delighting them. Instead, he decided to punish the girl by starting to reach out to her. Seeing this and hearing his words, Honey was horrified and froze in place again. Hunched over and closing her eyes, the heroine trembled with fear, expecting a cruel punishment. Placing his hand on her head, the emperor stirred the girl's hair again, confusing her. The punishment was that Frederick would now pat her on the head without warning. The emperor also hoped that the little girl would soon get used to it. As it was getting dark outside, he decided to let the children go, and Oswald, Honey, and Drake were unanimously delighted. However, Frederick had only the children in mind while the captain needed to stay a little longer. After all, didn't they need to discuss something, for example, when Drake managed to be so impudent? The captain pretended to be fine and behaved in a similar way in front of Honey, but it was not at all like that. He held the position of commander of the knights, which made him seem old and tired. Therefore now, most of all, he did not want to go to the training ground. To do this, he decided to use the method used by Honey, building a cute face, but for some reason it didn't work. The emperor was angry, because Drake was already an adult and should have a conscience. So Frederick ordered him to take the sandbags and return to the training grounds. The story of Eleanor's death had plunged the entire palace into chaos, and Honey was glad that she had found out so soon. It was not surprising that Sir Drake returned that day with a strange expression on his face, because she had been killed by the people before execution, pelted with stones. Her end was not much different from the one in her previous life, when the people rebelled against her for trying to poison Constance. She was a magnanimous empress who cared for her people, even after the death of her husband. Now, the situation was radically different from what it was in the previous life. Since Honey revealed the fact of violence before the attempt on Melissa, society sincerely sympathized with her. The little girl understood that it would all end the moment her icy abilities were revealed to everyone. As long as the fear of magic was fixed in people's minds, she could not get away with it. However, her new room was furnished with new things, which meant that the imperial family sincerely cared for her. The heroine wondered if she had gotten used to the fact that she now had a family during this time. With these people who were always there, she began to cherish vain hopes again. That was why she felt guilty for hiding her abilities from everyone. Although Frederick gave her a music box and secretly provided the ice castle where she lived, Honey decided to tell him the truth, expecting to receive either help or consequences in return. However, it didn't matter anymore, and the girl was ready to accept any outcome. The next morning, she had a peaceful breakfast with Oswald in the imperial dining room. Honey thought that after all, as an emperor, Frederick might even benefit from her abilities, but the heroine had absolutely no idea how exactly to prove her usefulness. Seeing the girl's gloomy face, Oswald wondered what had happened to her. In response, she smiled, amazed at the boy's ability to notice every detail. After breakfast, the crown prince went to his lessons, promising to see the princess after them. Waving to him, the heroine decided that now was not the time for idleness. While Oswald was studying, she too had to find her own way to learn. Suddenly, she heard the voice of servants from the side, who were discussing the arrival of spring. After all, this meant that they would not be able to enjoy the ice shavings for a while. With their salaries, they could not even dream of such a thing in the warm season, only if they were fed by the imperial family. Viola, accompanying the little girl, was surprised that she suddenly froze in place. But the girl finally saw the opportunity she had been looking for all this time. On the same day, she greatly puzzled the maids with her unexpected decision. The girls first thought that they had done something wrong to her. One of the maids tried to explain that if the lady had any inconvenience, she could always turn to them. However, the girl began to insist on washing herself. The heroine still managed to convince the servants that she was no longer so small, after which she finally achieved her goal. The maids decided to wait for the princess outside, in case she needed anything. Left alone at last, Honey stepped into the middle of the bathroom and got ready. Concentrating, she began to wave her arms, releasing icy energy. Using a spell, she created an ice crystal in the air, which emanated a severe frost. The girl realized that her abilities remained at the same level as in her previous life, and this time it would be better for her to immediately reveal her abilities and prove their usefulness. However, due to his young age, he was not able to handle magic as delicately as before. The heroine will have to visit His Majesty after she regains her skills. Still, she was glad that she remembered the sensations of using her powers. After that, she washed herself and safely went out to the maids waiting at the door. Wiping the princess with towels, the girls found it cute that she decided to bathe herself. But even after 10 days, her decision in this regard remained the same, leaving the girls in a stupor. Throughout this time, Honey went to wash on her own every time. The maids thought that perhaps the girl simply did not want to show others her wounds on her body. They were sure that Her Highness needed time to move away from the terrible past. Therefore, each time they patiently waited outside the door while the little girl practiced ice magic. On the 10th day, she could easily control the ice, completely subduing it. Now everything was ready, and all that remained was to inform the emperor about it. In her mind, she hoped that Frederick would put his hand on her head again and pull her hair a little. But Honey also knew that if something went wrong, she would have to use her powers to escape. After all, the princess had already firmly decided for herself that she would never return to the snow-capped mountains. After a while, she finally arrived at the emperor's palace, which was guarded by Drake and his team. The captain was very surprised to see the girl calmly walking all alone. Smiling at her, he immediately realized that the princess had come here to visit His Highness. However, as it turned out, she also had something very important to tell the emperor. Suddenly, Honey noticed the gaze of one of the knights guarding the entrance. Deciding to smile at the girl, the knight distorted his face in a ridiculous grimace, putting her into a stupor. Shocked by what she saw, Honey thought that His Highness must be busy and would not be able to receive her. But Drake was sure that he didn't have much to do, so he ordered Scott to notify Frederick of the princess's arrival. The beast turned out to be the same knight who smiled at the girl and did not understand what scared her so much. Finally finding herself in front of the door of the emperor's office, the heroine hesitated for a while, after which she knocked awkwardly. Having received permission to enter, she resolutely opened the door to see Frederick sitting behind a pile of papers. Remembering Drake's words and seeing a huge stack of documents on Frederick's desk, the girl decided to come in another time. However, the emperor believed that she had nothing to worry about because he could finish this job very quickly. And no matter how busy he was, Frederick couldn't just send his younger sister away when she came to him. First of all, he invited her to sit down at the table, on which there were various sweets and a kettle of tea. The emperor was eager to hear what his sister wanted to tell him, but suddenly the girl got up from the table and fell to her knees, bowing to Frederick on the floor. Her request was that His Highness allow her to stay in the imperial palace. Taken aback by her request, Frederick believed that in this case she did not have to ask. It was only natural that she should have stayed here, since the emperor was the girl's older brother. But Hani knew that until this moment she hadn't told His Highness one important thing. And when he hears this, he may change his mind about her. Gathering her strength, the princess confessed that she had the ability to freeze ice. For a while, the emperor stood motionless, silently looking at the girl. Hani didn't know if she should start her escape or wait a little longer. Now, Frederick understood why his words did not calm the heroine. He wondered if Eleanor knew about her ability, to which he received a negative answer. After all, at the moment, only 2 people knew about Hani's strength, and both of them were here now. The heroine understood that she could hide it to the end, but did not want to pay for the service rendered by the emperor in this way. Frederick was absolutely calm and, moreover, ready to help his sister. The girl stared at him in surprise, not understanding why he agreed so easily. In turn, Frederick also did not understand why the heroine had a face full of disbelief. He knew that it was dangerous for the possessor of an ability that terrified the entire empire to remain in the imperial palace. However, Frederick had already become convinced that Hani was not the kind of child who would abuse her powers. After all, if the girl had a desire, it would have happened a long time ago. And first of all, Eleanor would certainly suffer, then probably the maids. But it was Hani who appeared all scarred from regular beatings. The emperor knew that he would never be able to forget about this incident. Therefore, trusting the girl, he hoped that his choice would not be wrong. After that, he sat down next to the princess with a smile, holding out his hand to her. Although the girl had prepared for the worst, she was very glad that the emperor believed her. Remembering that in such cases it is proper to give thanks, Hani thanked His Highness from the bottom of her heart. Frederick was also grateful to the little girl for her incredible courage. After that, he will stir the hair on the girl's head, delighting her. The emperor found out that the girl already had complete control over her abilities. She knew it would be better to show it, but she had to choose a place where it didn't matter if there were any traces of water. Then, Frederick suggested that we go to the bathroom, which was right next to this office. Hani was shocked, not imagining how busy he was, that his office had a private bathroom. Arriving at the place, the girl stepped aside, preparing to begin. Taking a deep breath, she concentrated the magic in her hands, summoning ice crystals. After that, she made the boulders rise up, while Frederick calmly watched what was happening. In front of his eyes, Hani began to shape the ice, ranging from geometric shapes to Oswald's head. Of course, the emperor had already heard from her about her good command of the ability, but the result exceeded expectations. At the same time, he understood that in this world there are no eternal mysteries. Therefore, Frederick wanted to offer to use these abilities for good, and Hani even had an idea about it. She thought it would be possible to create ice and then sell it, using the proceeds to help people in need. The emperor knew that the main problem of the ice business was the inability to maintain the ice. But if Hani uses his magic correctly, then the ice will be almost undamaged. Deliveries will become active, people's lives will improve, and then, even after learning about the girl's magic, no one will judge her. Having received consent to her idea, the heroine was completely delighted. When Frederick learned that she was going to give the money left after helping people to the emperor, he was taken aback. Unable to stand it, he laughed, reading that his sister did not need to try to pay him, at least because she was still at an age when it was natural just to receive. The emperor decided that she would keep the remaining money for herself, but hoped that the girl would donate something to charity. He believed that the good deeds that Hani would do would one day become a force that would protect her. At this point, the girl decided to bow out, saying goodbye to His Highness. Suddenly, a shiny bracelet fell out of the baby's dress, sending Frederick into a stupor. Realizing that he had noticed and was picking up the bracelet that had fallen out, the heroine was horrified. The bracelet turned out to be quite simple, and the emperor did not understand why she carried it in her pocket and not on her hand. Suddenly, it dawned on him that there was her money, taken in case of escape. Honey had to admit that she was going to run away if something went wrong, and the bracelet was, for this case, for sale. The girl was afraid to look up at His Highness, who suddenly began to laugh hysterically. Frederick burst out laughing at the fact that out of all the abundance of jewelry in her room, Honey chose this simple bracelet. Seeing that the heroine blushed like a tomato, he twisted even more with laughter. Having coped with a fit of laughter, he understood the girl and promised to stop teasing her. Now she could safely return to her place, especially since Oswald had probably already lost the girl. Bowing goodbye, Honey thanked His Highness for her mercy from the bottom of her heart. As he watched the little girl go out at the door, Frederick remembered a man. As the Emperor thought, this man would be perfect for such a job. Going out into the street, the heroine was very happy that everything ended so well. Suddenly, she was called by Scott, who approached the princess and bowed to her. After introducing himself, he gave his name and that he was a member of the Order of Chivalry. Honey immediately remembered him by his unforgettable smile, which gave her goosebumps. Scott felt that on that occasion, his behavior could be quite offensive. He thought the girl looked worried, so he tried to help, but he seemed to overdo it. Therefore now, Scott asked Her Majesty's forgiveness for his behavior. Falling face down on the ground, he was ready to accept any punishment that the princess deemed appropriate. Honey tried to calm him down, realizing that the hero did it out of concern for her. But Scottus objected, not accepting such favor, for such should be the relationship between a master and a knight. At least, the captain had always taught from that, and just at that moment, Drake arrived. Ordering Scott to be silent, the captain apologized to the heroine for his behavior. Honey then hurried to explain that the noble knight had only come over out of concern. In that case, Drake was happy to introduce a knight who, despite his young age, had become the second strongest in the order. Smiling, Honey and Scott promised to take care of each other. The knight was a little embarrassed that the captain praised his knightly skills so much. He decided to try even harder and become a good warrior for Her Majesty. Looking at them, the girl dreamed that everyone would treat her with the same kindness. Frederick had a half-brother, Christopher, who flatly refused the title of Archduke, eventually becoming a duke. There was no one better for the production of ice, since he owned the mountains of Herne. After a while, the Emperor invited the baby to his place to introduce her to Christopher. Last time, Honey did not touch the cakes, but this time she could not resist, and they turned out to be incredibly delicious. Duke was indeed perfect for this business, but the problem was whether or not he recognized Honey. Of all the members of the imperial family, he hated Eleanor the most, and therefore her daughter. Suddenly, the door swung open abruptly, and Christopher appeared on the threshold. However, the Duke's disheveled appearance greatly puzzled the main character. In Honey's memoirs, he is remembered as an eternally neat, handsome man in glasses and a prim tuxedo. Due to the lack of glasses, he did not even see the baby, passing by her with a doomed moan. Plopping down on the couch next to his brother, Christopher was glad to finally rest. Frederick considered this a brave act, but his brother had already rushed here for 4 days without respite, on the orders of the Emperor. The Duke was perplexed, not understanding what such urgency was for. As it turned out, there was a good opportunity for investment, and Frederick wanted his brother to go back into business. Seeing Christopher's dumbfounded look, the Emperor clarified that he was talking about the ice business. The Duke was surprised to think that during his absence some new technology for storing ice had emerged. However, even if Frederick guaranteed success, Christopher did not understand why there was such a rush. Then Honey could not stand it anymore and explained that by the new method, the Emperor meant her abilities. Hearing an unfamiliar voice, the Duke became alert as he began to take out his glasses. Looking through the lens, he saw Honey, Eleanor's daughter, sitting in front of him. Furious, he didn't understand what abilities he was talking about and why did this girl forget here. Frederick introduced her as her brother's future partner, wanting her to demonstrate her abilities. Since Honey's ice-making power was quite dangerous, the Emperor wanted to assign her a slightly different role. When Christopher heard about the power again, he was completely confused. Frederick wanted his sister to maintain the temperature and integrity of the ice for a long time. After receiving the order to act, the princess began to concentrate the magic in her hand. Then, in front of the shocked Duke, she created several ice spheres in the air. Gathering them on a platter, she immediately presented them to the Emperor. It was condensed cold air that could help the production machine keep the ice frozen longer. Christopher was taken aback by what he saw, realizing that it was indeed the power of ice. And he could not help but admit that with such an ability, the ice business would be doomed to success. However, the Duke did not want to have anything to do with the woman's daughter, and then the Emperor decided to tell him the latest news. The girl didn't want Frederick to insist so much if the Duke really didn't want to. However, the Emperor still decided to try, realizing that soon the fun would begin. First of all, he explained to his brother that the woman had been dead for a long time. After that, he told Christopher in detail about all the events that had happened and about Honey. After listening to the story, Christopher slammed his fist on the table so that all the cups and plates of cakes fell off it. Crying with rage and indignation, he didn't understand how much longer this would happen. The heroine heard that the Duke was a cold-blooded man who would not even bat an eye if someone died in front of him. But seeing him sobbing loudly, the girl once again realized that the rumors could not be trusted. Although he looked quite stern, according to the Emperor, Frederick was full of sympathy. After finishing his sobs, Christopher took the contract from his brother's outstretched hand. Looking at the cups and saucers scattered on the floor, the heroine was glad that nothing broke. Only now did she realize the reason for the Emperor's reaction to the bracelet, which was certainly cheaper than these utensils. After carefully studying all the points, Christopher came to the conclusion that everything suits him. Then Frederick asked him to vacate one of the palaces within a couple of days, which surprised the Duke. However, the Emperor planned to give it to Princess Honey, as she did not yet have her own palace. The girl decided that it was not necessary at all, because she could live in the old palace. But Christopher insisted, because he would also have to visit the heroine every time according to the contract. Then the girl gave her consent, embarrassing the Duke a little. Once the problem had been resolved, the Emperor now intended to dispose of the things in the girl's former palace. Honey agreed, wanting to keep only one thing out of everything. After receiving permission, she immediately ran away to get it from the palace as soon as possible. As punishment for his impudent behavior, Frederick sent his brother to fetch the baby as a porter. Agreeing, Christopher went outside when he saw the heroine near the fountain. The girl walked along the road to the gate, and the Duke followed. All the time they were on the way, they did not say a word to each other, and the girl did not notice his presence at all. As she approached the palace where she had once lived with her mother, Honey stopped for a moment. Christopher looked with interest at the surroundings of the castle, which he had not been to in 10 years. Going inside, the heroine headed for the door leading to her former room. Inside, there was a real pogrom and chaos. Broken interior items were lying everywhere. Seeing the mess in the room, Christopher wondered if there was anything to be found here at all. But suddenly the girl began to pick up a broken music box from the floor, leaving the Duke in a stupor. Earlier, he had been very resentful of Frederick's decision to give it to the woman's daughter. But the Emperor simply decided to make a gift to his sister, who was the same age as Oswald. And now, the heroine carefully collected the remains of the box from the floor, looking at them sadly. Unable to hold back his emotions any longer, Christopher sobbed again, betraying his presence to Honey. She was very surprised that the Duke also decided to come here. The hero admitted that he came at the request of his brother and was puzzled by the princess's valuable thing. Seeing that the box was broken, he considered it dangerous for a small child. But the girl was determined not to throw it away. However, the Duke meant to give the box to him. Surprised by such a request, the heroine slowly approached him and reluctantly handed him the box. The way back to the palace ran in the same silent atmosphere. Suddenly, Christopher stopped and turned to the young princess, puzzled her. The Duke admitted that all this time he sincerely hated the baby for being Eleanor's daughter. He couldn't think of anything good, knowing the essence of that woman, but then he realized what the girl had to go through. Christopher believed only what he saw and, in the end, hated innocent people. And the hero understood that now it was too late for this, but still he made up his mind. After bowing, he apologized for condemning Honey until now. He was sincerely sorry for all the pain that he had caused her with his attitude. Of course, he didn't dare to ask to accept his apology right now. But Christopher intended by his deeds to prove his sincerity and earn the right to forgiveness. Seeing his honesty, the main character also decided not to be silent and say everything. She knew the reasons for his hatred and thought she couldn't do anything about it anyway, even though it hurt her. It was very unfair, because a person does not choose where to be born. And yet, Honey was wholeheartedly grateful that the hero was the first to apologize. She believed in his sincerity, so she gladly accepted them, which took Christopher aback. But the princess had no doubts, because he himself promised to prove everything with deeds. Therefore, the main character hoped that the Duke would just keep his word. Looking at her innocent smile, Christopher began to slap himself in the face, believing himself to be real trash. Honey tried to stop him because she had a cut on her hand from a broken box and she had to hurry. Agreeing with her, the Duke wrapped his arm around the girl's stomach, lifting her up and starting to calmly step back. Confused, the heroine once again confirmed that rumors cannot be trusted. Meanwhile, in Christopher's palace, there was an atmosphere of bustle and everyday life. After a short time, the Duke entered the front door, still with the baby in his arms. Seeing him, one of the servants, named Maurelius, was surprised that the master had returned from the emperor so soon. The maids were also glad to see their master, and they were curious about how the meeting with His Highness went. Suddenly, they saw a little girl that Christopher was holding under his arm. The girls and the servant were in shock as he carried the princess as if she were a thing. They knew that the poor thing must have been uncomfortable, and besides, she certainly didn't dare to do anything against the gloomy gentleman. But Christopher thought it would be all right, because he had already warned Oswald like that, who didn't say anything. Realizing that Honey might be in real pain, he apologized to the girl for the inconvenience. The maids also began to apologize to the little girl who, in their opinion, found it difficult to endure the Duke's rudeness. But the princess began to justify the hero, thanks to whom she got here very quickly. Taking a candy from her pocket, one of the maids handed it with a smile, wanting to treat the baby. It was a handmade candy from a well-known pastry shop, which had an extraordinary taste. At this moment, the heroine felt a strange excitement inside, not understanding what was the reason for it. After the girl gratefully accepted the treat, the maid introduced herself as Gerda. Suddenly, Gerda and the others saw a cut on Honey's arm, horrified. Catching the puzzled looks, the Duke explained that the heroine had cut herself on a broken box. The servants were very glad that their fears about their master were not confirmed. Christopher ordered them to go immediately and bring the palace doctor to them. While waiting for the doctor, the hero decided to take the young princess to the living room. Gerda and Maurelius were told to follow them, while the rest of the servants could go about their business. The workers wondered if the gentleman had sent them out too abruptly. Waving his hand, the Duke ordered them to bring refreshments for him and the girl into the drawing room. Walking after Christopher, Honey turned around at some point, waving her hand to the remaining girls. The maids were delighted with such cuteness, not hiding their emotions. They were surprised that despite the outward resemblance to Eleanor, the atmosphere around the girl was completely different, and since the master had brought her here personally, they wanted to do their best for the little girl. A few minutes later, the royal healer arrived in the living room to the heroes. Honey had expected to see Agnes, but instead a businesslike man with a briefcase walked in. His name was Augustus, and his presence made the heroine uncomfortable. After examining her, he concluded that the princess only needed to bring down her temperature a little. August was indignant, not understanding why such a talented healer as him should waste his time in this place. He had personally treated the emperor, and now he had to deal with a poor princess without power and connections. As he said all this aloud, his gaze suddenly fell on the Duke, whom he immediately recognized. Then the healer's face immediately changed, beginning to suck up to the hero and flatter him. August thought that now was not worth wasting time on a worthless child, and it was better to examine the Duke first. He immediately noticed a small cut on Christopher's cheek and wanted to start dealing with it immediately. As for the baby, according to the doctor, her wounds could have waited a little. Being shocked by what they heard, the servants concluded that the number of yard healers had just decreased by 1. They only hoped that the master would not get too angry, otherwise he might scare Honey. Christopher gave the order, and the 2 servants went to Augustus, who was in a stupor. Approaching abruptly, they twisted the frightened healer on the floor in an instant. Augustus did not understand why the Duke suddenly decided to do this to him. Christopher was surprised that it came as a surprise to someone who ignored the princess. The healer tried to justify himself because the hero himself also recently considered the baby a beam in the eye. However, even if the Duke hated her, did that somehow cancel out the royal title of princess? And how dare the healer look down on a member of the royal family? But Christopher did not deny that in the past he really hated Honey. And now, as Augustus himself can see, everything has changed dramatically. This means that the hero will no longer allow such garbage to ignore and belittle the princess. He intended to report this situation personally to the emperor while Augustus awaited his punishment. The servants dragged the man into the corridor, from where his heart-rending screams were heard for some time. Gerda thought that if she had known about this beforehand, she would have simply asked for medicine. Honey was absolutely calm, because she had long been used to this. Christopher was horrified by her words and stared at the girl in bewilderment. Sitting opposite him, he did not want to hear such things from her anymore. The Duke would always be willing to help her, so he hoped that if anything happened, Honey would immediately turn to him. Starting to heal her wounds, the hero suddenly drew attention to the baby's strong thinness. As it turned out, she was even fatter now than before, which made Christopher confused. When he finished with the treatment, Morelia wondered where the gentleman got the scar on his cheek. To the servant's surprise, the Duke injured himself for an hour by hitting himself in the face. He did this as punishment for being quite rude to Honey. Then Morelius and Gerda remembered that their lord had done many things that deserved punishment before, and now they were glad that he had matured and began to think more rationally. Sighing, Christopher wondered how their attitude would change if the owner suddenly changed. Hearing about the change of master, Mavrelius came into a stupor and opened his mouth in surprise. Then the hero was happy to introduce them to the new mistress, pointing his hand at Hani, which had already been confirmed by the emperor. He hoped that the servants would care for her with the same trepidation as they did for him. Gerda and Morelius jumped for joy because now it would be much more fun in this palace. When the day of the heroine's move came, the servants in her former room were actively collecting things and tidying up. According to Viola, August was convicted of corruption and sent to prison on the outskirts. She also dressed up the princess, dressing the baby in a chic dress with sequins. While Honey was worried about how she would greet the new servants today, Oswald stood next to her with a pouty look. He believed that the girl was not at all obliged to go to another palace and leave him here alone. Hani was grateful to him for his words, but there was nothing to be done, and the luggage was almost packed. Then the boy made her promise that they would visit each other every day. It was time to go, and Christopher entered the heroes to call the baby. Honey nodded, and Oswald expressed a great desire to go with them. However, the Duke was aware that the boy had lessons today, but he just smiled silently. The hero did not have the strength to resist, especially since if he had simply forbidden it, then Honey would have begun to console Oswald. Approaching the heroine's new palace, Christopher's face around took on a very surprised expression. Smiling and clutching his head, he thought that someone clearly did not know how to restrain himself. After walking a little more, he covered the eyes of the little girl with his hand, who suddenly smelled the aroma of something sweet. As the Duke approached the entrance, he wanted Honey to look ahead very carefully now. Withdrawing his hand, he revealed to the girl's eyes a crowd of servants who had arranged a feast in honor of her arrival. The heroine was shocked by the colorful scenery and endless compliments addressed to her. Passing through the corridor of service personnel, joyful greetings were heard from everywhere. Seeing the shock on Hanya's face, Gerda thought that it was too early for the mistress to be surprised. At these words, even the ever-prim Duke felt rather uncomfortable. At that moment, a chef appeared from the palace, carrying a 3-tiered cake of his own making on a cart. Oswald was deeply impressed by the grace and beauty of the works of confectionery art. Unlike him, Honey looked at the giant cake with eyes full of horror and shock. The heroine had never had this before, and she thought that she did not need it. And now the heart was beating in a completely different way than it had been before. Smiling, Oswald thought that Honey was the main character today, so she just needed to enjoy. Stretching out her hand to him, the girl realized that now she really was not alone. She considered not only the cake beautiful, but also everything that was prepared for her today. Crying with happiness, Honey compared it to if it was her birthday today. At these words, Morelius also shed tears, and Gerda thought that this was the best day for them too. Hearing the proposal to blow out the candles, the baby was confused because she did it for the first time. At that moment, Christopher realized that no one had ever thrown a party for her before. Therefore, the Duke decided to properly prepare for the banquet in honor of her birthday. First of all, the heroine shared the chef's signature cake with all those present. Looking at the atmosphere of this place and tasting the cake, Oswald decided that he was ready to entrust them with honey. Christopher fell into a stupor, thinking that it was strange to hear such words from his nephew to his aunt. The hero hoped that the princess was not burdened by anything, and she was calmly enjoying this day. The girl nodded, deciding that she liked everything very much and was just grateful. Honey didn't know why, but she liked the people here. Since Christopher had met them at her age, he could guarantee that they could be trusted. After a moment's thought, the Duke decided that he couldn't leave the box broken. When she heard that he was going to fix it, the heroine was very surprised, considering it impossible. However, according to the Duke, they had the most skilled craftsmen in the Empire who were capable of this task. Honey stared at the hero, realizing that later she could listen to this wonderful melody of the box again. Oswald decided to stay overnight, and later they lay down together on opposite sides of the bed. Lying in bed, the girl remembered how 2 years ago she was given that box. The reason why she was able to live to see these days was because Honey hid her from her mother's eyes. But that time the girl forgot to hide the box, which is why the tragedy occurred. Somehow they managed to start all over again, so it seemed that there was no reason to be on the alert anymore. However, looking at Oswald sleeping now, Honey decided not to let her guard down any longer. Moving closer to the boy and taking his hand, she decided to protect herself and her family. Unlike the heroine's previous family, these people taught her completely different ways of showing love. And the first person to make Honey feel this was Oswald himself. Deciding to protect him to the very end, the baby fell asleep, holding the boy's palm in her hand. The next morning, gentle girlish hands gently touched Honey, trying to wake her up. Opening her eyes, the baby saw Viola's joyful face in front of her, looking at her with a smile. Honey was surprised, but as it turned out, the maid could not return. They did not even greet the mistress. The reason why Viola was absent yesterday was the transfer of duties, which surprised the princess. The little girl did not understand whether the maid of the emperor, whose status is the highest after the chamberlain, would work here. Viola decided to reintroduce herself, stating that from that day on she would be the princess's personal maid. At yesterday's celebration, the heroine was looking for a girl, not wanting to part with her without saying goodbye. Honey, of course, had thoughts that it would be great to continue to stay with her. However, it seemed strange to her that His Majesty's maid should have to deal with an ordinary princess. But Viola objected because she considered this to be the best place for work. Touched by the cuteness of the heroine's puzzled face, the girl saw a sleepy Oswald appear behind the baby. The level of tenderness became critical, and the girl could hardly restrain the frantic thirst for hugs. Instead, she remembered being the first to see Honey's wounds a few months ago. Viola's heart trembled when she learned that the girl endured in silence, not making a single sound. She began to worry as she saw the child cowering and watching everything around her. And after a few days had passed, Honey smiled shyly and thanked for the first time. Only then did Viola truly realize how kind a girl the princess was. And at that moment, the maid wanted to get to know the mistress even more, deciding to go to her. Barely holding back tears, the heroine wanted Viola to be by her side now. When he finally woke up and heard the conversation, Oswald pounced on them with tender arms. The maid remembered that she had woken up the girl because the Empress Melissa was about to arrive. The purpose of her visit was to sew clothes specifically for Honey, for which she would bring a tailor with her. The heroine was confused, looking at Viola in bewilderment. As it turned out, in addition to Melissa and the tailor, Drake, Christopher and His Highness Frederick also arrived. The Duke just caught a glimpse of something going on and decided to attend. The Emperor had no particularly important business to attend to, and the captain was simply accompanying him. The Empress had always wanted to do it together if a daughter was born, but she didn't think it would happen that way. The heroine was sure that she had bought enough things last time, but Melissa did not think so. In addition, the Empress wanted to give the princess a worthy housewarming gift. However, judging by the number of outfits, Honey thought that more than one store had been brought here. Frederick was surprised that his wife wanted to try on all these outfits on the baby, but the girl did not consider it something difficult. Starting the fitting, the princess showed each outfit to 3 characters who could not decide which one looked better. One of the dresses was made of a special silk and was much softer than all the others. Since it will be worn by a child, the Empress paid special attention to comfort. When the fitting came to an end, the heroine was completely exhausted, having tried on dozens of outfits during this time. To her surprise, Melissa was about to buy her all the things that had been chosen. Realizing that it was time to pay, Frederick, Christopher, and Drake took out their checks at the same time. But as it turned out, the Empress had already paid for everything, bringing the heroes into a stupor. She ordered checks to be signed every time Honey wore a new dress. Taking the girl in her arms, the Empress wondered if the princess had a hard time today. Honey didn't understand why she was so tired because she had been sitting still all day. Oswald promised to come immediately after class, but in the meantime, the heroine was carried to her room where she instantly fell asleep in bed. After a while, in the former palace of the heroine, rumors were heard from everywhere about a wonderful life in her new home. No matter how devilish a woman Eleanor was, her daughter turned out to be the sweetest princess. Some thought that now everyone felt sorry for Honey because she was a child, but what would happen when she grew up? The maids in the girls' palace were glad that with her arrival, Christopher also began to appear more often. And now, walking along the territory of the palace, the heroine suddenly saw the Duke. The girl immediately ran to greet him, but the hero thought that it was dangerous to run like that. As it turned out, she knew in advance about his arrival, so she came here to meet as soon as possible. After carefully examining her dress, Christopher suddenly began to take off her raincoat. Wrapping the girl in it, he realized that today it was cool, and it was easy to catch a cold in her clothes. The heroine tried to justify herself, because of her strength she could not freeze, but the Duke did not want to hear anything. After that, he took her in his arms with a straight face and went to the palace. Coming to Frederick, he and the Emperor had an argument about the baby's hairstyle. The Duke was shocked at how his brother did not know how to choose the right uniform. The main purpose of their meeting was to prepare for the ice business. The project will be implemented on behalf of the Herne Peak, so now it was necessary to occupy the market in each region. The technical problems that Honey solved, thanks to her ability, will be impossible to hide. Hearing that it would be necessary to publish a statement, the Emperor was confused. The Duke wanted to inform everyone that they had found a way to solve the storage problem, but it was top secret. Just at that moment, he finished doing the girl's hair, carefully styling her hair. After that, he handed over to Frederick all the documents about equipment and logistics, as well as the budget plan. Looking at them, Honey had the impression that the heroes felt neither fear nor disgust for her power. They were surprised, thinking that she probably wanted to be feared. Hearing this, the heroine immediately shook her head, because this was not what she meant at all. The heroes were completely calm and saw absolutely no reason for fear. However, Frederick admitted that there was a time when he was frightened just because the girl had magical powers. And since the conversation went in this direction, he also admitted that Oswald also had power. Hearing this, Honey fell into a stupor for a few seconds, realizing the information she had received. Coming out of her trance, she exclaimed in shock as she looked at the Emperor in bewilderment. Then Frederick came over and stroked the girl's head, trying to calm her down a little. At first, the Emperor considered it a coincidence how perceptive the boy could be. But over time, it became clear that the Crown Prince had something like the ability to foresee. It was the power of the God of Light, which caused the heroine to be confused again. From her previous life, she already knew that he was the main god of the entire empire. It symbolized light and the sun, and also had the ability to prophesy and foresee. Although Oswald's power is not always manifested and does not depend on his will, it has already been of great help. The heroine also knew that not only the Crown Prince had such an ability, but it was not yet the time. Now she understood that this was not an illusion at all, and the boy really saw through her. And who knows, maybe on that day, it was not by chance that he found himself in that corridor and saw how the maids were dragging her. The creature that Honey had been resentful of to death had generously bestowed her love on someone else. But if it was really Oswald, then the child who was called the Light was indeed loved by the Light. The heroine wondered how many other people know about the abilities of the Crown Prince. As it turned out, almost all members of the imperial family were aware, as well as about 5 other people, including the High Priest. Then the girl wanted to know if she could now tell the boy about her power. Frederick understood that there might be difficulties with this, and that it would be better to wait for the time being. After all, as he had said before, it would be safer if as few people as possible knew about the princess's strength. Realizing the depth of his feelings, Honey apologized, thinking that she had said something stupid. Later, leaving the palace with the heroine, Christopher noticed her drooping appearance. Then, as if by chance, he decided to clarify that soon the princess would have to go to classes. The girl was very surprised, but the Duke understood that since she was already used to the palace, she could start studying. At that moment, she realized how perceptive the Duke was. After all, studying was Honey's cherished dream. However, the little girl was overly cautious, which is why Christopher only noticed it recently. If she is just jealous that nothing will change in life, and what the hero said earlier about his help were not empty words at all. Then the girl sincerely smiled and thanked Christopher for guessing her wish. After escorting Honey to the palace, the Duke returned to the Emperor, interrupting him from his work. There was real horror and shock on the Duke's face, which made Frederick even a little confused. The Emperor thought that his brother had forgotten something, but as it turned out, it was the princess. In the Duke's opinion, it was necessary to hire a teacher for her as soon as possible. The Duke told the Emperor about a recent conversation with the little girl, that he wanted to comfort her, but Frederick thought that it was too early for her to start studying, although he had been studying his dreams since childhood. However, when he found out that the girl herself expressed such a desire, Frederick immediately changed his mind. First of all, he wanted to know if there was someone for the role of teacher. Christopher offered a choice of 2 teachers, of whom the Emperor chose the more loyal Sir Harvard. When the decision was approved, Frederick personally sent him a letter asking him to come. After a while, the ice business developed day by day, and word about it began to spread. One day, Christopher heard Oswald wonder if Honey had begun puberty. The heroine was already lost from surprise, and the Duke snorted, covering his mouth with his hand. Honey turned to him, hoping for help, but the Duke could hardly hold back a burst of laughter. As it turned out, the boy had recently seen such words in a book and decided to study their meaning. It was written that the teenagers were trying to take a bath on their own, which the little girl did, practicing magic. Then, making a feigned, thoughtful look, Christopher suggested that it could really be puberty. Seeing the girl's gaze, he began to pray that she would understand the joke. Then the hero decided to explain to the crown prince that the princess just needed time to get used to the new environment. It was for this reason that she behaved this way, to which the boy nodded affirmatively. Oswald was not one to be fooled by such words, but it seems that Christopher did it. Looking ahead, the Duke was horrified to find that it seemed that everyone had already arrived. The boy began to hurry everyone up, realizing that they were already late. They were going to a family dinner which would be the first in Princess Honey's life. Entering the dining room, the Duke apologized for being a little late. He also apologized separately to Mother Empress Constance. In response, she smiled and invited Princess Honey to sit next to her. Agreeing, the little girl realized that it was the first time she had seen Her Majesty since she had first arrived at the palace. Melissa was perplexed by Oswald's hairstyle, which Christopher had done. Once everyone had gathered, it was time to start, and soon, the table began to fill with the delights of culinary art. The very sight of the dishes made the heroine dizzy, and a frantic appetite awoke inside. Constance suggested that Honey start eating with salmon, which was very tender. Putting a piece of fish on her tongue, the princess's eyes sparkled with pleasure. The Empress was very glad that the little girl appreciated the extraordinary taste of the dish. Afterwards, she began to offer her other viands, while the Duke watched them intently. He was very surprised when his mother managed to become so caring. When she and her brother were little, they could not even dream of this, because their mother believed that they could do everything on their own. Constance was surprised that an adult man could be jealous of his younger sister. Frederick smiled as he realized that his brother wanted his mother's care so badly and didn't want to give in to her younger sister. Then the Emperor decided to take care of his brother himself and threw a piece of salmon into his plate. After that, he began to stroke Christopher's head, telling him to chew many, many times. Frederick tried very hard to keep a serious expression on his face, but his strength was running out. The funniest thing was the expression on Christopher's face, who was shocked by what was happening. Unable to stand it, the Emperor and everyone else burst out laughing, looking at the bewildered face of the hero. As he ate the fish, he thought that Frederick might have fun, if only he didn't overdo it. A few minutes later, Constance remembered that the princess was now looking for a teacher. The Empress was a little sorry that the little girl decided to start training so quickly. Nevertheless, she believed that the main character would cope with everything. Constance believed that in Honey's small hands, there were so many opportunities that would allow her to be whoever she wanted. Therefore, she wanted the girl not to listen to anyone and follow the call of her heart, and also not to rush, because there was a time for everything. Even after the end of the family dinner, the girl remembered these words, looking at her palms with a smile. And in general, she really liked today's meeting, and was a little sorry that everything was already over. On the day of moving, and now, the heroine really liked the atmosphere when everyone gathers and spends time together. The Duke believed that there was nothing to regret here, because there would be many more such evenings ahead. Besides, when the princess sees what awaits her in the palace, she will only be glad that everything ended earlier. It was something she had been looking forward to, and after thinking for a while, Hani looked at the hero in amazement. She thought it would take a long time to repair the box, but thanks to his innate charm and tight wallet, the Duke made a deal. They immediately hurried to the palace, where Christopher handed the heroine a small chest. When she opened it, she saw a music box that had been completely restored. Pleasant memories began to fly before the baby's eyes, from which her eyes began to sparkle. For a few minutes, Honey stared fascinated at the gift, which until recently she had not even hoped to see repaired. Taking it with her hands, the heroine carefully examined the box from all sides. The broken parts and glass had been replaced, and now it looked like it was new. Turning on the melody, the girl lay down next to her, breaking into a gentle smile and truly enjoying life. Sometime later, as she was leaving class, she unexpectedly met Christopher. He greeted her back and found out that the teacher was so active that the little girl also had to try hard. Usually Harvard wasn't that active, but it seems that looking at the heroine made him motivated. As it turned out, the Duke left the house today for the first time in the last 3 days. To Honey's surprise, the reason for the Duke's busyness turned out to be Oswald. The boy wanted to walk with the princess along the streets, so Christopher tried to somehow occupy his time. However, now, he wondered if the baby would agree to a walk. The girl's eyes lit up with a twinkle, and she gladly agreed, realizing that she would go out of the palace gates for the first time. The march was scheduled for the next day, as the Duke needed to recover a little. Now he had to concentrate on his work, and Honey had to make about 20 particles of condensed air. After so much training, she created ice particles in the air with much greater ease and grace. Gathering them in a bag, she safely handed it to the Duke. After thanking him, Christopher noticed that Honey had become even more skilled in this business. Perhaps this was influenced by talk about puberty, which made the baby ironically lower her eyebrows. In any case, she, as always, did an excellent job. The next day, disguised as commoners, the 3 heroes prepared to set off. Oswald was delighted that even in this dress, Honey remained as cute as ever. In these clothes, she had the feeling that she was really going outside, which made her heart beat faster. Looking at the Duke, the girl was surprised to find a huge sword on his belt. As it turned out, the hero did not speak it very well, but he took it with him just in case. In any case, it was worth relying on Christopher in this regard because he knew only the basics. His father once told Oswald that his uncle was better at martial arts than fencing. Looking at the Duke, Hani realized that such a physique could not be achieved without serious training. In addition, the previous emperor usurped the throne, which annoyed many rich people and created political enemies out of them. Therefore, for sure, the childhood of his 2 eldest sons could not be called calm. After a while, the heroes finally arrived at the shopping street of the capital of the empire. The heroine was impressed by the amount of everything around, from goods to people. First of all, Christopher instructed the children not to run away alone and follow other adults. He made them repeat all the points until their teeth began to bounce. A few minutes later, the children were finally free and breathed a sigh of relief. Starting to move along the street, the eyes of the heroes ran in different directions. First of all, Honey was surprised by the variety of fruits on street stalls. She was also impressed by the variety of fish and how the ice they create is used. Compared to the palace, the atmosphere was completely different, which made the girl very happy. Seeing the corn dog seller aside, Oswald wondered what it was. Without the slightest idea, Christopher suggested that the children try it themselves with the money he had given. The saleswoman was happy with such nice customers and announced the price. Taking out their bags and making simple mathematical calculations, the heroes counted the required amount. Especially for the kids, the woman chose the largest and most appetizing corn dogs with a lot of sauce. The children were fascinated by the unknown deliciousness from which an alluring meaty aroma emanated. The taste of this product turned out to be incredibly delicious, delighting every cell of the body. After trying a few more types of street delicacies, the children were surprised to find that their money had disappeared somewhere. Continuing along the shopping street, one of the shops attracted Honey's attention. These were jewelry, among which something special stood out. These were 3 bracelets that had a deep name: Precious, give a person your unchanging heart. Knowing that the children's financial reserve was being reset, Christopher offered to pay for it himself. Oswald and Honey put on 1 bracelet each, looking at the jewelry with satisfaction. They gave the 3rd bracelet to the Duke, who found it very touching. Passing further, the heroine raised her head and suddenly, unexpectedly, froze in place. In the distance, above the houses and the forest, towered the gigantic snow-capped Mount McLeod. It was the highest mountain in the entire empire, which could be seen from everywhere. The incredibly strong cold, which found itself in the center of the country, instilled terrible fear in the inhabitants of the empire for 500 years. Turning her head, Honey saw a good-natured fruit vendor who was smiling at a young customer. The heroine understood that if everyone knew about her abilities, then no one would smile at her anymore. Meanwhile, the heroes gradually climbed to the top of Herne, where the administrative building of the district was located. A young man, working intently at a desk, was surprised that someone had entered the building. Seeing that it was the Duke, the young man was horrified, trembling all over. He didn't understand what had brought His Highness here, while Christopher was surprised by his reaction. The reason was that during his last visit, the Duke had brought him a lot of work. Having learned that today he was just walking, the guy calmed down and decided to get acquainted with the children. The Duke introduced him to the Crown Prince and the Princess, which surprised the young man. As it turned out, the guy himself was called Bob, and he led the area from the top of Herne. Since His Highness had come anyway, Bob wanted to give Christopher some documents to check. The Duke hoped that while he was away for a while, the children would calmly wait for him without leaving the room. He sincerely believed that as long as they were here, nothing could happen. And so it was until one moment, looking thoughtfully out the window, Honey saw something terrible. Rising abruptly from her chair, she frightened Oswald and confused him. Running outside, she hoped that the boy would call Christopher as soon as possible. Despite Oswald's objections, she could not ignore the adult's abuse of the child. Running out into the street, the heroine began to frantically look for the knights accompanying them. Turning the corner, she finally saw Scott and the others, who were surprised at her arrival. The knights wondered why the young princess was alone in the city street. It was too dangerous, and Scott wanted to know what exactly had happened to her. Taking the young knight by the hands, she begged him to come with her and help the poor thing. Scott looked at the other warriors in confusion, who nodded silently. Taking the lady in his arms, he and the others quickly headed in the direction indicated. Suddenly, Honey saw a horrific sight ahead that caused her to disobey the Duke's orders. Furious that the little girl denied that she had money, the adult threw her aside. Not taking her word for it, he took a glass bottle to force her to hand over the money. However, according to the girl, the man had already taken everything from her 2 days ago. In tears, she began to appeal to his reason, because in such a short time it is impossible to collect more money. Deciding to check the information, the man began to swing the bottle at the girl. But suddenly, his hand was caught by a knight, who considered this method quite dangerous. At the same time, Scott turned Honey around so that she couldn't see what was happening. He also asked the victim to turn away, promising to figure everything out. The man began to rampage, insulting the knights and trying to escape. Then, one of them made a sharp jerk and knocked the bottle out of the hands of the scoundrel with an accurate blow. Seeing that the girl did it, the enraged man attacked her with his fists. Having successfully blocked his blow, the knight brought the man into a stupor. Knocking him over and giving him a powerful kick, she slammed the bastard into the wall of the house. Grabbing the place of the blow, the peasant trembled with pain and overwhelmed terror. Then another knight approached him and pointed his sword at the villain's head, hoping that this would finally calm him down. Suddenly, the peasant saw next to him the very bottle that had been knocked out of his hand. Mad with fear and anger, he demanded that the soldiers not stick their noses into something that was not their business, throwing the bottle forward. The cattle managed to catch her a second before she reached Honey's head. Grinning sinisterly, the knight thought that the man had crossed all boundaries. After that, the man's painful moans began to be heard behind the princess's back, which caused her to cover her ears. Taking out the rope, the knights decided to do everything properly and tied him up. The man, beaten beyond recognition, even being tied up, continued to insult the characters. Then Scott could not stand it anymore and knocked him out with a blow to the neck, bringing everyone to a stupor. Henny looked at the injured girl, her eyes tinged with disbelief and contempt. The princess decided to clarify whether everything was all right with the rescued baby. The girl guessed that it was the princess who asked the soldiers for help. However, did the naive heroine really think that the girl would be grateful for this? She did not care at all about such help, and she looked at the rescuers with a disgusted look. Looking at how an aristocrat helps someone is no longer pleasant, and even more offensive when it is done out of stupid greed. Afraid that then all the anger would fall on her and her mother, the girl asked to take the heroine's pity back. Hani tried to explain that she was acting out of genuine sympathy, but the girl didn't want to listen. She was infuriated by the show of sympathy from the one who dragged the 3 guards behind her and asked to call her mistress. Seeing how tense the knights were, the heroine signaled them with her hand not to interfere. The girl was right that Honey knew absolutely nothing about this world, but she knew well how painful it was when you were beaten, so she ran to help. She wondered if the girl knew Princess Honey, Eleanor's daughter, which horrified her. Seeing such a reaction, the heroine showed her hand, strewn with scars from constant beatings. Previously, Honey was in such pain that she wanted to die, but thanks to the help of others, she was now able to live happily. Among other things, she spoke about the 3 knights who accompanied and guarded her. Therefore, the princess wanted to help, seeing how an adult hurts a child. This is not just a good deed. From an ignorant aristocrat, the heroine wanted to share what she received herself. Therefore, Hani invited the girl to go with her to the imperial palace if her parents allowed her. At that moment, an enraged Christopher appeared behind the heroine, carrying Oswald under his arm. Honey was glad to see them, and the girl was horrified by the appearance of another aristocrats. Both heroes began to vie with each other to ask questions, wanting to know what happened and whether the princess was injured. The Duke was shocked by her sudden escape, and the baby only smiled guiltily. One of the knights volunteered to explain everything that had happened to the lord in detail. However, looking at the little girl and the tied man, the hero himself began to guess. After listening to the knight's story, the Duke found out that the victim's name was Judy. She admitted that the attacker came to her as her own father. They never had any work, as their family owned a shop inherited from their grandfather. At some point, my father became interested in gambling, and when there was no money left, he mortgaged both the house and the shop, losing them. Then my father began to get drunk and forced him and his mother to work in order to bring money, which he used to gamble again. Her mother's acquaintances and neighbors tried to help her divorce him, but this only angered the man even more. Judy knew that she had no forgiveness for offending Her Highness, but the heroine fully understood her feelings and hoped that the girl would allow her to help. Christopher supported the princess, thinking that if they had already begun to help, then they should see the matter through to the end. Then Judy decided to ask to help her mother get a divorce, but it was not even discussed. Such a chance does not come often, so the Duke wanted the girl to show immeasurable greed. In addition, now it was in the power of Christopher and Honey to fully help her with all questions. Judy went into a trance, still digesting what she had heard and finding it hard to believe what was happening. Later, the heroes walked, discussing the main character's admission to the prestigious National Academy. Honey could calmly concentrate on her studies while Christopher took care of Judy's help. At this point, Oswald and the princess began to take turns praising the hero, considering him cool, smart, and rich. Then the Duke decided to add that he also had power, after which everyone laughed in unison. However, he hoped that Honey was not trying to laugh it off now so that he would forget about the escape. On that day, the princess had to return to the palace and learn 101 rules of safety for children. Judy's father was imprisoned, and he and her mother established a life so that the girl could enter the academy. The sudden changes in the family's life attracted the attention of the villagers, who did not know who exactly provided them with help. Also, in addition to classes with the teacher, now the heroine took etiquette lessons under the guidance of Mrs. Melissa. After studying so hard, Honey's blood sugar dropped and she pretty much leaned on sweets. Sitting at the table with the Empress, the girl suddenly saw Melissa begin to cough violently. Suddenly, the Empress jumped up from her chair, continuing to cough and begin to moan in pain. Henny was in a stupor, not understanding what was happening and frantically trying to come up with a plan of action. Suddenly, the heroine realized that all this time, the Empress was pregnant. In a past life, Eleanor poisoned Melissa, killing the baby in the womb along with her. After a while, the pregnancy was confirmed, and Frederick and Constance came to congratulate the Empress. The children were also here, and Oswald was incredibly happy to know that he would have a brother or sister. For 8 years, there had been no new grandchildren, so Constance proposed to arrange a holiday. Melissa thought it would be great if the whole country could rejoice at this event. However, first it was necessary to visit the temple of the God of Light and pray for the well-being of the child. Honey also joined in the congratulations, for which she received sincere gratitude. The Empress couldn't wait to see how beautiful this child would be. Eleanor was no longer there. No one would poison the mistress, but for some reason the heroine was very anxious in her soul. After a couple of days, the Emperor with his wife and children finally went to the temple of the God of Light. The Holy Father Kelvin came out to meet them, accompanied by monks from the church. They greeted the honored guests and servants of the God of Light with a bow. Wishing them to be in the wind, the Kelvins suddenly fixed their eyes on the heroine. Hanny was greatly puzzled by this, and the Holy Father began a conversation with the Emperor. Kelvin was glad to know that His Highness and the others had arrived safely. They spoke formally, but it seemed that Frederick and the Holy Father were friends and felt comfortable with each other. After talking, everyone went to the main worship house, where a stone statue of the God of Light was installed. First of all, everyone bowed and then cleansed their lips and hands with holy water. After that, the time came when everyone began to pray on their knees. For a while, the heroine watched everyone pray, closing their eyes and opening their hearts to God. After that, she shifted her gaze to the statue of the God of Light, remembering the past. Before her death, she had prayed a lot, and now she was doing it again. Honey was almost certain that her prayer would not be answered, but she hoped that at least once the God would not turn away from her. The girl sincerely wished that the child of Melissa and Frederick was safely born. After the ceremony was over, the Emperor wanted to leave for a while and talk to Kelvin. Agreeing, the Holy Father suggested that the children take a short walk around the church for the time being. Listening to his speeches about the beautiful flowers of this place, the heroine had a strange feeling inside, as if something was wrong. Unlike her, Oswald looked at Kelvin with rounded eyes, as if spellbound. The girl did not understand why they had to go anywhere, but the Crown Prince suddenly insisted on taking a walk. As she left, Hani couldn't shake the feeling that the Holy Father was looking at her strangely. Suddenly, she had the terrifying thought that Kelvin might find out about her powers. Scott and his partner went with the children, and the knight admired the spring views of the surroundings all the way. Scott decided that he wanted a brother like Oswald, and his partner would be happy to have a swordsman's sister. Suddenly, a garden of indescribable beauty opened up before the characters, with fragrant flowers and a spring palette. The children were stunned with surprise, and the escorts opened their mouths in admiration. Oswald put on a thoughtful face and remembered that it must be somewhere here. Not understanding what he was looking for, the heroine felt as if she was suddenly covered with a shadow. Something flew like lightning right over their heads, confusing everyone. The knights immediately rushed to the princess and the crown prince to protect them from an unexpected enemy. Grabbing Honey, Scott made a sharp jerk, jumping far to the side. After that, he fell to the ground, holding the baby in front of him and pressing her to his chest. Whatever it was, the hero was glad that the attempt to harm the children was a failure. Her partner wanted them to stay there while she dealt with the enemy. But suddenly, to her surprise, the boy thought that there was nothing wrong with what had happened. Looking at the place where the intruder had landed, the knight froze in amazement. In front, between them and Scott and Honey, stood a huge tiger with a 4-pointed star on its forehead. The princess looked at the furry giant with apprehension, not understanding who he was and where he came from. It was a sacred being of this place, blessed by the God of Light, named Light. Hearing this from Oswald, the heroine wondered why the sacred tiger suddenly appeared in front of her. Seeing Light begin to approach the princess, Scott stood between them, drawing his sword. Honey theorized that due to her strength, the tiger perceives her as an enemy that needs to be eliminated. Oswald hastened to calm the heroes because, according to him, Light did not intend to attack at all. On the contrary, the tiger was very happy to see them, but was upset that they blocked his way. Approaching the boy, Light held out his paw in greeting, much to his surprise. But suddenly, Oswald put his index finger forward, scolding the tiger. After all, Light had almost injured Honey, so he had to think carefully about his behavior. The tiger's ears immediately drooped, the eyes closed, and a miserly tear flowed out of them. Approaching the heroine, the boy first of all made sure that she really did not hurt herself. Honey thought that she was fine thanks to Scott, but the hero himself was sure that he was just doing his duty. Besides, compared to what Commander Drake usually does, it was nothing like that. But Honey continued to praise him, and Oswald joined her. Such praise was the best in the service of a young knight, though it embarrassed him. Suddenly, the tiger crept up behind the princess and poked her head, pretty much frightening her. His eyes were very kind, although according to Oswald, Light was somehow particularly naughty today. As he walked closer to Honey, the boy thought that she must have sensed something strange when Kelvin had sent them here. Then the heroine realized that he knew about everything and was guided by his intuition. Honey looked carefully at Oswald and Light, who had received blessings from the god of light. She found the couple incredibly sweet, but the knights were confused. After all, how could a 4-meter tiger with a tail thicker than a wrist seem cute? Light approached the girl and put his in her arms, after which he purred. Of course, she saw wild animals on the snowy mountain, but this one made her feel warm, like the sun. The children began to scratch the satisfied predator, in whose eyes there was bliss. The obedient kitty gave them a paw, bringing the heroes to incredible delight. The cattle had heard that this creature was not so friendly, so now he was genuinely surprised. However, Honey considered him just a large and stray cat who needed affection and attention. Suddenly, Captain Drake's bewildered exclamation was heard from the sidelines. The Emperor, accompanied by the captain and the clergy, was on his way to them. Noticing the tiger, Drake demanded to know what was going on here. Slamming his forehead into his forehead, Kelvin thought that Light hadn't been here for a long time. Frederick and the others noticed that against the background of the kitty, the princess looked very tiny. Honey was outraged, not at all considering herself a crumb, after which the Emperor personally apologized. The Holy Father promised that in the future they would be careful and try to prevent such a thing. If the day came when the baby needed his help, Kelvin was ready to atone for his guilt. The heroine remembered this, deciding that it could be useful if her power was unleashed. Suddenly, the tiger came up to her and licked her palm, playfully closing his eyes. Honey took this as an apology, and the attendants, including Kelvin, were shocked. After all, they knew this beast as capricious, which did not even allow itself to be touched. When Frederick gave the command to leave, Light's eyes changed abruptly. He was in tears to say goodbye to the girl, but there was nothing he could do. Honey then tied one of her bows to his paw, hoping that the tiger would keep him until their next meeting. Along with all the attendants, Light went out to see the heroes off and waved his paw with a bow goodbye. The next morning, the princess slept peacefully in her bed and watched beautiful dreams. Suddenly, through her sleep, the girl felt her hand running over something resembling wool. Hugging something that looked like a soft, warm cloud, the heroine sniffed sweetly. Suddenly, a thought flashed through her head, from which she instantly woke up. Jumping up and brushing off the blanket, she cried out in surprise at the sight of the small tiger. But at the same moment, she recognized the guest's features as the same Light, happy to see him. The heroine was surprised that the tiger was able to reduce its size so much, becoming an ordinary ginger cat. With that, Light made a graceful movement and gracefully jumped to the floor from the bed. Touching the floor, he turned into a huge tiger again, looking at Honey with a smile. The princess realized that he had been punished yesterday for attacking her in this uniform. Honey was grateful to Light for coming, but if anyone else saw him, there would be a commotion. Just at that moment, a joyful Gerda entered the room, wanting to wake the princess. Seeing a huge tiger near her bed, she froze in place, screaming in horror. Pulling herself together, she asked Her Highness not to make a single sound. Falling to the floor, the maid crawled to the mistress's bed like a partisan, looking at the beast with apprehension. Grabbing the girl, she ran out of the room as fast as she could, heart-rending for help. Because of her screams, there was a real commotion in the palace, and everyone was confused. Later, when he was alone with Honey and Light, Frederick listened to the story of his sudden appearance. Calmly holding the kitty in her hands, the princess was sure that he had come here to meet her. Most of all, the emperor was amazed that the tiger even brought his belongings, neatly folded in a basket. This meant that Light apparently had no plans to return. Realizing what the conversation was about, the small tiger jumped off the heroine's arms, running to the basket. Rummaging through his belongings, Light took out a large emerald and handed it to the emperor with a satisfied look. Frederick knew that it seemed that the temple had not yet noticed his absence, but Light must return. Then the emperor decided to talk to the cat alone, asking Honey to go out the door for a while. The hero waited for the girl to leave the office before starting to speak. Turning to the cat, the emperor admitted that even he could not control the fate of the divine property. And even if he could, the fact that the divine beast left the temple for the princess would not benefit anyone. In this case, Honey will receive a huge amount of attention compared to what it was before. This may help her status, but given her icy abilities, it may also do more harm than good. From Light's look, Frederick realized that the cat did not see a problem in what he had heard. However, Honey was also the next contender for the throne after Oswald and Christopher. And if her name is associated with a divine being, then aristocrats with hidden motives can use it. As an older brother, Frederick was grateful to the cat for his kindness to his sister, but he did not want to make the situation worse. Hoping for understanding, the emperor ordered Light to return to the temple right away. Realizing that there was no other way out now, the cat immediately disappeared into thin air, leaving a golden trail behind it. Looking at the remaining basket, Frederick wondered if Light had forgotten it or decided not to give up. Summoning Charles, the emperor ordered him to take the basket back to the temple and make sure that no rumors spread. 2 weeks later, Frederick was sitting in his office again, working with documents. Suddenly, a red cat appeared out of thin air and sank down on the desk and looked sternly at the sovereign. The emperor hoped that the beast would have enough conscience to immediately descend to the floor. Suddenly, the cat spat out an envelope in front of Frederick and left the desk safely. The letter turned out to be from Kelvin personally and was spit through and through by a cat. It said that this beast would not be stubborn for no reason, and it would be better for him to stay in the palace. Upon hearing that the emperor had admitted defeat after reading the letter, Light pleaded with delight, but his hair stood on end at the fact that Frederick had 2 conditions. Only by observing it, the cat would be able to stay here, and otherwise he would have to return. Sitting up and pricking up his ears, Light prepared to listen attentively to His Highness. The first condition was that no one except the imperial family and closest associates knew about the presence of the sacred animal. The second condition was much more important than the first, and the emperor came closer to whisper it. After voicing both conditions, Frederick saw the tiger's gaze become more serious. Taking a step forward, Light lifted his head and looked carefully into the emperor's eyes. Frederick took this as a sign that the negotiations were over. Looking at the cat calmly licking its paw, something seemed strange to the emperor. Suddenly, Honey walked into his office and she was incredibly happy to see Light. Frederick did not understand what exactly interested the divine animal in this girl. The heroine was completely delighted to learn that the tiger would remain in the palace. He was very persistent, but if anything, Frederick can just pretend that nothing happened and send the cat back. Honey never dreamed that Light would like it so much and that they would be able to spend so much time together. The emperor was involuntarily touched, seeing how the friends had agreed to always get along. Now he thought that it was not strange that such a beautiful child would be liked by a divine being. In addition, now the princess has a very reliable guard. A month later, when the news first broke that there was ice at the top of Herne, the reaction was mostly negative. This was due to the fact that the ice business was notorious for the rapid bankruptcy of entrepreneurs. However, Christopher was able to become #1 in the market in just 1 month, thanks to stability and low prices. It was also possible to equalize the price of ice, regardless of the season, and get rid of black merchants thanks to the Duke's connections. And now, sitting in the gazebo with his brother, he felt neither alive nor dead. Frederick understood that in such a state it must have been difficult to do business. Not far from them, on the lawn, Melissa and the children were sitting, laughing and talking animatedly. Christopher had already heard rumors about the divine beast and wanted to take a look at it, but it must have been dozing somewhere now. Initially, the emperor was worried about him, but now he realized that his fears were unfounded. They got along so well with Honey that the cat was ready to bring her a whole basket of jewelry. The Duke was perplexed, not understanding where the beast got it unless it had robbed the Holy Father. But as it turned out, all these riches really belonged to him. This was strange, because usually the divine beings in the temple are not interested in human jewelry. However, this cat was different and was ready to do anything to deserve the love of the heroine. Not so long ago, the children gave the tiger a new nickname because the name Light symbolized his relationship to the god of light. When Christopher learned that they had named him Ottoman, he choked on his tea, almost choking. Although the tiger was still a child, by the standards of divine beasts, but being the size of a house, the name Ottoman was not very suitable for him. In the meantime, Melissa and the children continued to laugh merrily, talking about various topics. Honey was wondering, does the mistress want a boy or a girl? Thinking about it, the Empress decided that she would have thought about her daughter earlier, since she already had a son, but now it didn't matter to her who it was, because Honey was like her own daughter to Melissa. From such cuteness, steam poured out of the heroine's ears and she blushed all over, which made the Empress laugh. Oswald sat with a look of genuine joy on his face, laughing merrily with the others. The Duke looked at the boy attentively, replaying various thoughts in his head and deciding to talk to him. Frederick was surprised by his decision to take Oswald away, as he was going to make more ice with Honey's help. However, Christopher insisted on taking the Crown Prince today. Later, the Duke helped him pack his things while talking. The boy was surprised by his uncle's help, knowing how tired he was. Suddenly, the Duke wondered if the prince felt unhappy about having to share everything with Honey. After all, before that, absolutely everything in the family belonged only to him from birth. Thinking about it, the boy remembered that he had already heard this question when Honey had just moved into the palace. Then one maid decided to ask Oswald what if the princess made him less loved in the family. However, he was sure that just because Dad and Mom loved a girl didn't mean they would love him less. The Crown Prince never thought he was sharing anything with her, but on the contrary, they received enough love together. And this applied not only to him and Honey, but also to the unborn baby. Oswald believed that his uncle had nothing to worry about, and at this time, Christopher was in a state of shock. Laughing, he realized that today he got to know his nephew better. Grabbing him and squeezing him, he confused Oswald. And when he called the boy his baby, Oswald was completely taken aback because his parents were Frederick and Melissa. Standing outside the door, Honey heard that Christopher considered his brother's child to be his own as well. The heroine decided to come early and bring an ice bag, but now everything has turned abruptly. The Crown Prince had no idea how much strength his sincere love gave the girl, and although she was still scared and unsure, thanks to how bright the boy was, the heroine could walk forward even from the shadows. Honey wanted the soon-to-be-born baby to receive so much love, too. The next day, sitting at the table, Melissa looked up from the magazine to say something to the princess. But to her surprise, the baby slept without hind legs, leaning back in a chair. Hearing the Empress's voice, the girl immediately jumped up, pretending as if she had not slept at all. Melissa suggested canceling classes so she could rest, but Honey was eager to learn. Apologizing for the excitement, the heroine hurried to her lesson. Looking after the princess, Melissa thought that perhaps she felt bad because of the change of seasons and was seriously worried about her and the prince. Then she decided to write a letter to Christopher and prepare a medicinal decoction for the children. It seemed that the summer flew by especially quickly this year, perhaps due to the large number of events. The Empress believed that this year would indeed be etched in their memory forever. Meanwhile, someone in a dark robe stood in front of the entrance to the palace, watching what was happening. In a dimly lit room, Melissa's body lay on the floor, struggling to continue breathing. Agnes, who arrived in time, was able to neutralize the poison and save the Empress, but the child in the womb was dead. From such news, the heroine was seized with terrible horror and a feeling of complete despair. Eleanor wrapped her arms around the baby's body like a monster, bursting into sinister laughter. The woman didn't understand how a monster like Honey dared to think that he deserved happiness. At this point, the girl woke up in a cold sweat, trembling with fear all over her body. With difficulty catching her breath, she began to slowly recover from what she saw. That night, she was again unable to sleep properly and began to wash her eyes tiredly. The fact that Eleanor died did not mean that it was all over. The woman's accomplice who had helped her poison the Empress was still in the palace. The problem was that the little girl knew absolutely nothing about him. There was a complete mess in her head, and the heroine decided to go out and breathe a little fresh air. It was late at night outside, and hearing a noise to the side, the girl became alert. There she saw a man looking at the palace and dressed in a dark robe. On the back of his robes was the pattern of a ram's skull, which made it even more sinister. Remembering something, Honey fell to the ground, numb with horror. After all, she had already met such a robe once before her return. That time, she wandered through the palace where she and her mother lived, looking for a piece of something to eat. Suddenly, she saw a man in this robe at the far end of the corridor talking to Eleanor. From the conversation, it was possible to hear that they were working on something, and the woman agreed to wait a little. At that moment, the girl was hiding behind a nearby chest of drawers and did not understand who it was and what kind of robe it was. And now it was happening again, at the same time and in the same clothes, and also the stranger's behavior was very suspicious. The heroine had almost no doubt that this was the same accomplice of Eleanor. However, at such a distance, it was impossible to see the face. Besides, he was standing with his back. If you looked at the skirt, it looked like it was one of the servants. Sitting down on the grass and sighing sadly, Honey thought it would be great to learn more. She felt it was her duty to reveal the identity of the man in the robes and protect Mistress Melissa. Unexpectedly, the Ottoman appeared, and the heroine looked at him intently. She had the idea of sending the cat to the Empress as a personal guard. The girl hoped that the divine beast would fulfill her request, because only he could protect the mistress without anyone knowing. The cat meowed affirmatively, and the baby, thanking him, let him go. In the same second, it vanished into thin air, leaving behind a golden glow. Suddenly, the girl heard a strange noise and rustle of leaves behind her. She was horrified when she realized that it looked like someone else had decided to come here. Hiding, she watched from behind the shelter to see who would come out of the forest. Suddenly, another man in a dark cloak but without drawings came out of there. Thinking that this was another accomplice of Eleanor, the heroine tried to examine his face. Seeing that it was a small child, Honey exclaimed in surprise. At the same moment, she realized that she had just been safely spotted. Seeing that the boy had scarlet hair, the heroine suddenly regained her sight. The hero was very surprised that he managed to meet his sister here. Standing up from hiding and looking at him in bewilderment, Honey was also surprised to meet Terence there. Despite the fact that the previous emperor had an adult wife, Constantius with 2 children, he took 2 more wives. After his death, he left behind 4 descendants, including Honey by Eleanor and Terence by his second wife. And now, the heroine unexpectedly met a little former prince. She didn't understand what had brought the boy here, since his family rarely went out at all. After thinking about it, Terence decided that he could not tell his sister this, especially since the princess was here in her pajamas, not to mention slippers. Since the heroine was a member of the royal family, she had to behave accordingly. Honey was shocked by such impudence, not understanding how it was possible to look at people like that. She admitted that she just went out to get some fresh air and ended up here. After that, an awkward silence hung in the air, which made the girl feel uncomfortable. Realizing that she apparently had nothing more to say, Terence turned around and began to leave. The princess knew that it was about 40 minutes to walk to their palace. This meant that the boy did not say something, and could it be that his family was also involved in the poisoning? The next morning, the little girl stood by the window, remembering the events that had happened during the night, after which she went to Melissa. She was worried about Terence's unexpected visit, but the most important thing now was the protection of the Empress. Realizing that the culprit might well be one of the maids, Honey suddenly met the maids in the hallway. The girls were carrying some boxes, and did not understand why the princess was here at this time. The heroine looked intently at the maids, who smiled sweetly back at her. The girl knew little about them, except that one of the maids had long served the Empress. Seeing her serious face, the girls assumed that Her Highness must have important business. They thought that Honey was in her pajamas because her servants were not performing their duties well, but the girl calmed them down. She just had a nightmare with her mother and decided to see Mrs. Melissa as soon as possible. Touched by what they heard, the maids decided to split up so that one would see the young princess off and the other would take care of the medicines. Honey was very surprised to learn that their boxes contained medicines that Christopher had sent at the request of the Empress. Hearing the Duke's name, the little girl was petrified with horror, replaying various thoughts in her head. Now, if she is not vigilant, the attackers may even try to frame Christopher. After that, she hurried to the Empress as soon as possible. Melissa did not expect such an early visit from the little princess and was surprised. The heroine wished her good morning and was glad to see the lady full of strength and in good health. The Empress wondered what was the reason for such an early visit. Making a sad look, the girl admitted that she had a terrible dream, so she decided to stay with Melissa, so she jumped up from her seat and rushed to the baby. Squeezing the girl tightly in her arms, the Empress tried to drive all the terrible thoughts from sleep from her mind. After all, as she thought, it was just a dream that would never become a reality. At that moment, Honey remembered how Melissa's body was lying on the floor, almost lifeless. However, she believed that, as the lady had said, this dream was not destined to become a reality. The Empress ordered the servants to inform the princess's palace of her whereabouts, bring her clothes, and prepare breakfast. And she also wanted the maids to prepare a medicinal decoction so that she could drink it after eating. As it turned out, this decoction was intended for the baby as a health prophylaxis. The heroine was shocked by the information received, thinking that if there were medicines for her, then what about the poison? Upon learning that some of the medicines were also for Oswald, Honey feared that he had fallen ill. But in fact, Melissa thought that he would also benefit from an additional bonus to immunity. After all, the boy had a special strength which caused the baby to be stupefied. When he was born, he was very weak, but then he began to recover and now there were no problems. But Melissa was still worried, as a parent should, and showed the same care for Honey. Therefore, she hoped that even if the decoction turned out to be bitter, the girl would endure a little. After that, the princess stayed with Melissa to wait for the servants who were supposed to bring her a change of clothes. She was glad that she would be able to be with the Empress all day today. Now there was no way to search the kitchen, so all that remained was to be closer and not to lose vigilance. Soon the two maids came together, which surprised the lady a little. One of them, who had worked for the Empress the longest, had already told about the entire cuisine and breakfast was almost ready. Melissa was grateful and glad that they were doing well. However, the girls were worried about one thing. They thought for a long time whether to tell the Empress about it, and finally decided to confess. It seems that the third maid had some trouble, which caused her to constantly walk around with a drooping face. The other servants were unable to learn anything from her, and so Melissa decided to take care of her personally. The girls also remembered that this maid went out somewhere at night. This was evidenced by the fact that her outerwear was not in place at that moment. The little girl was horrified, thinking that the man in the robes must have been her. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, and it turned out to be the same maid in question. At last, they were all assembled, and the two ladies proceeded to the dining room, seated at table. First of all, several waiters brought them pickled mushrooms as a light snack. The heroine sat all tense, intently waiting for the moment of poisoning. However, everything turned out to be fine with the food, and the Empress and the princess began to eat. At the same time, looking at the drooping maid who had been talked about earlier, it immediately became clear that something was wrong with her. However, could a man who had decided to commit murder really be so excited? Suddenly, the heroine caught the fierce gaze of the maid who had worked for Melissa the longest. Now, at one glance, the girl's hand began to tremble violently, not allowing her to use the devices. The Empress, in turn, was having breakfast peacefully, with an absolutely unsuspecting look. Suddenly, the Empress took a glass of water, which made Hani tense even more. At that moment, the girl remembered that the poison was in a cup with a hot drink. Something had to be done urgently, but unfortunately, the heroine did not have the opportunity to report everything to His Majesty. At that moment, one of the maids brought a tray on which there were 2 cups of decoction. Melissa asked for only one, but the man who handed the decoction to the maid decided that the unborn child would also benefit from health support. The Empress found this very nice of the girl and gladly agreed. Honey stared as the maid placed both cups on the table, suspicious of her. But the girl was amazed that this was the same maid who had worked for the mistress for more than 10 years. After measuring the temperature of the drink with a probe, the girl suggested that the baby do the same. Agreeing, the heroine noticed how the maid was warily watching her every action. Pulling out the probe, she seemed to accidentally touch the cup, knocking it over on the table and spilling the contents. Honey began to apologize, but Melissa calmed her down because the main thing was that they didn't get on the clothes. In this case, she asked the maid to re-prepare the decoction, to which the girl agreed with a smile. After her departure, the heroine had a little time to somehow report everything to His Majesty. First of all, the baby opened the window and called for her pet, hoping for his help. Rubbing his muzzle, she was glad that the Ottoman was safe and hoped that everything was fine with him. She decided to send a letter to the emperor through it, although there was no paper nearby. There was nothing to do, and the heroine wrote a letter directly on a serving napkin. Now, the cat needed to urgently go to His Majesty and deliver the message as soon as possible. The moment he disappeared, one of the maids wanted to change Her Majesty's clothes. It was a girl named Fedora, who was said to have been walking with a drooping face lately. After dressing Mrs. Honey in a dress, she asked her to stay for a while to say something. However, at the same time, she began to sign up, as if she could not squeeze the necessary words out of herself. Holding her hand, Fedora stared at the floor with a face full of despair. Then the girl decided to directly clarify whether the girl knew that there was something in the broth. After that, the maid's face took on an expression of horror, and her entire body was covered with cold sweat. As it turned out, it was not her doing, because she would never have done that. Fedora admitted that there was poison in the cup with the decoction, which caused the heroine to be stupefied. The girl was very sorry, and it was clear from her that the maid was forced to participate. Now was not the time, but later, the heroine hoped to hear from her the details of what was happening. Honey was also sincerely grateful to the girl for her courage and recognition. Thanks to her, the princess was now convinced for sure and hurried back to the empress. When she came back, the girl did not know. Is it better to tell everything now and ask for help? At this moment, Melissa sat opposite the heroine and calmly read the magazine. Honey decided not to speak head-on, not wanting to present it like that. In the end, the truth would be revealed, and the little girl hoped that it would not be a big blow to the mistress. Seeing how the maid with a tray came to them again, the heroine decided to choose the right moment. After checking the temperature, the maid offered drinks, but Honey suddenly refused. She asked to cool the decoction a little more, which the empress found amusing. Then Melissa decided to taste it first, but suddenly the princess screamed, jumping up from her seat. The maid and the empress looked at her in bewilderment, surprised by such a reaction. Not wanting to wait any longer, the heroine took a silver watch out of her pocket. After that, she began to intensively dip them in a cup with a decoction, wanting to reveal the presence of poison with the help of silver. Melissa looked blankly at the maid, who stood with a stony face. At this moment, the maid began to have suspicions about the baby. Taking the watch out of the cup, Honey was surprised to find that it was in perfect order. Then the maid laughed, thinking that the princess was having nightmares again. But suddenly, the girl asked the maid to give her a handkerchief. The girl did not understand why this was happening, but the heroine suddenly began to insist. Honey knew that it was pointless to check for poison in this way. After all, the maid must have done something to the place where the cup touches her lips. Having wiped first the cup and then the watch with a handkerchief, they suddenly began to actively turn black right before our eyes. Now it was an indisputable fact that there was poison on the cup, and the little girl turned her gaze to the empress. Melissa's face darkened with horror, and she couldn't take her eyes off the watch. At the same moment, the maid abruptly grabbed Honey's arm, pulling with all her strength. After that, she knocked the baby to the floor, causing the empress to jump from her seat. The maid was furious, not understanding how this little girl could have guessed. Abruptly lifting her skirt, the girl drew a knife attached to her leg, apologizing to the empress in advance. Melissa looked in horror at the maid, who had worked for her longer than anyone else, refusing to believe what was happening. The maid screamed because she didn't want things to go that far. The heroine realized that it was too late to try to stop the killer, and there were no guards yet. The only way out was to use the baby's ice power. There was no other way out, and the heroine began to concentrate ice magic in her hand. After that, she created an ice ball, preparing to freeze the killer. At the same moment, the door swung open and knights appeared on the threshold, led by Captain Drake. The maid was ordered to immediately drop the weapon and raise her hands above her head. Realizing that the maid was still a danger, the girl ran up abruptly and pushed her. From surprise, the girl instantly collapsed to the floor and the knife fell out of her hand. She looked furiously at the heroine, infuriated by this little thing. However, at the same moment, several knights' blades rushed straight at the assassin, preventing her from moving. The Empress looked at her most faithful servant in confusion. Honey and Melissa watched as the knights led the culprit, who began to scream hysterically and break free. At the same moment, the Emperor entered, looking at the Empress and Princess in a frightened way. First of all, he wanted to make sure that the girls were not injured. Realizing that they were safe and sound, Frederick hugged his wife and sister tightly. Now, the Empress couldn't stay in this palace and go to the healer as soon as possible. Honey looked at them awkwardly, wanting to tell the Emperor something. But suddenly, Melissa interrupted her in mid-sentence, enclosing her in a strong, gentle embrace. The Empress also had many questions, but she understood that the little girl only wanted to protect her. Therefore, although Hani's actions were reckless, the Empress was grateful to her for her courage and her salvation. The heroine was also glad that she had managed to neutralize the killer, but now she felt an incredible tension from the Emperor. Suddenly, Frederick decided that it was the princess's turn now, causing her to shiver. He did not understand how she knew who was to blame and that it was poison, and why she decided to act alone. Then the heroine clarified whether the Emperor knew that she had been falling asleep everywhere she could lately. Frederick nodded, thinking that it was because of the high temperature, but it turned out that it was only a pretext. After all, the girl could have told her that every night she had nightmares in which Melissa fainted from poison. For the same reason, she went for a walk at night to calm the alarm. In addition, she thought that her feelings were just a coincidence, and the girl wrote about everything else in the letter. Hani did not deny her guilt, but wanted to come to the Emperor as soon as she found a clue about the culprit. At first, she thought it was a simple nightmare, then she began to suspect the maids, and then she began to notice many strange things. It was not possible to act quickly because that maid was always there, so the girl decided to send a letter, but the maid still managed to prepare a decoction, so the heroine decided to stop her. Hani began to shake in sobs at the realization of the danger she had put the Empress in. But Frederick didn't want her to blame herself, and Melissa was grateful to her too. A great disaster could really happen, so the Emperor expressed his personal gratitude to the heroine. To his surprise, the girl decided that she would not want to hear such words again. After all, she was just protecting her beloved family and did it not to hear words of gratitude. Impressed by these words, Frederick apologized and promised not to say that again. Realizing that it was already difficult for the baby to do everything alone, he decided to send her to rest. In the meantime, the knights came with a report that evidence had been found in the kitchen. The Emperor decided that this was not for the child's ears, so he asked Drake to take the girl to his place. Later, Agnes arrived in the kitchen, and after analyzing the poison, found out that its symptoms appeared only after the incubation period. It has no color, odor, or distinct symptoms, which are unlike other poisons. If the Empress had swallowed the poison, neither she nor anyone else would have even known about the poisoning. There would be no evidence left, so even Agnes would not be able to recognize the poison and would not be able to do anything. After that, for a few seconds, an oppressive silence hung in the air. Frederick understood that if this poison was so secretive, then it could already be anywhere in the palace. Therefore, it was necessary to close the palace as soon as possible and evacuate the imperial family. However, Agnes and Drake also understood that a simple maid could not get such a poison alone. And what if the culprit was now targeting not only Melissa, but the entire imperial family? Meanwhile, Viola met the mistress in the palace, having already heard about what had happened. Now she wanted the heroine to change her clothes as soon as possible and have a good rest from everything. At that moment, the servants reported that Fedora had arrived at the princess. The maid looked at Viola uncertainly, wanting to tell Honey something. After that, she suddenly fell to her knees and bowed to the floor, confusing the girls. The maid never thought that this woman would threaten Mistress Melissa. She also understood that it was a mortal sin that could not be forgiven. However, the younger Fedoras were not to blame, and she began to beg to protect them. The princess had no intention of interrogating her and only wanted to hear everything she knew. As it turned out, Fedora was just an observer and, in case of failure, she had to commit the murder herself. She did not want it at all, but her father simply left the girl no other choice. The maid who tried to poison the mistress did not know about Fyodor and even about who was behind it. Honey suggested that it could be Terrence's family, which made the maid freeze in horror. However, she did not want to say anything, realizing that the baby might not be able to stand it. At this moment, Honey remembered that she was still a young and helpless princess. Whatever happened, the little girl promised to protect Fedora's siblings, in return asking her to report everything to the emperor. The girl was very grateful to the princess for her trust and for listening. The next day, Frederick ordered the closure of the palace and the evacuation of the entire royal family. Melissa, Oswald, and Constance immediately went to the family's remote mansion. After that, an investigation among the employees immediately began in the palace. Since Hani was one of the main witnesses, the emperor decided to delay her for a short conversation. Still, he wanted to understand how exactly the baby figured out the culprit. The thing was that the maid was checking the princess's hands to make sure she was right-handed. As soon as we entered the room, she prepared a decoction in a cup with a handle, and then Hani understood everything. The killer decided to take advantage of the fact that the empress was holding the cup with her left hand instead of the right. There was no poison in the decoction itself, but the maid watched which part of her mouth Melissa put the cup to. There was the same mug on the table, and Honey pointed her finger at the place where the poison was. The heroine did not check this, but she was sure that the same thing could happen to other cups. This was all the princess knew, and the emperor asked Captain Drake to verify the information. Soon, all the words of the heroine were fully confirmed, leading Frederick to amazement. He knew that Honey was smart, but he didn't even know how smart. Thinking that she was all in him, the emperor patted the girl on the head. Seeing Drake's laughter at this, Frederick did not understand why the captain had such an impudent look. In addition, it was horrifying that the poison was found in a box that Christopher had sent. It seems that the criminal not only wanted to frame the Duke, but to use the baby to divert suspicion from himself. Assuming that Melissa had taken the poison and Honey knew nothing, there were a lot of suspects. That maid would have been the first suspect, but she would have been immediately acquitted, according to the princess. She would have claimed that she had not poured the poison, and Honey would have confirmed it, so she gave the girl a taste first. Suddenly, the little girl decided to tell Frederick another important point. The emperor was shocked, not understanding how the little sister had so much information. The heroine told the emperor in detail about everything that was related to Fedora. Frederick appreciated everything she had said, but he was very concerned that the little girl was so deeply involved. If all this was true, then whoever is behind it controls the people in these vicinity. First of all, it was necessary to find an approach to Fedora and find out everything from her. It was clear that everything was serious, but now the emperor decided to be extremely careful. After all, he still has not recovered from yesterday when the criminal told about the customer. To Honey's surprise, the customer turned out to be her mother, Eleanor, which made the baby freeze in place. However, since Eleanor was dead, she could hardly have had a direct impact, but she may have been involved in some way anyway. The heroine understood that unlike the poison that her mother had got, this one was different, which meant that someone else had gotten it. At that moment, Honey remembered an unexpected encounter with Terence in the forest at night. The killer's room was searched and evidence of this deal was found. Now it remains only to find out the connection with Eleanor. You need to be very careful until the culprit is found, and in the meantime, the emperor decided to punish the woman's family. The little girl was afraid that suddenly Eleanor acted without the help of her family, but Frederick was sure that they were also involved. Her family were bankrupt aristocrats who lived off their modest fortunes. After Eleanor's death, their connection with the emperor was cut off, and they began to engage in illegal activities. All this time, the emperor turned a blind eye to this, but it was time to restore justice. Frederick knew that such news could affect Honey as well, so he wanted her to go to the estate the next day. The next day, the emperor sentenced the murderer to death and stripped Eleanor's family of their status and confiscated their property. A day later, when the news of what had happened came out, the entire empire was on its ears. Frederick looked at the hot headlines with horror, confused. As he thought, the public opinion of Hani was not the best, so he had to send her to the manor immediately. Collecting her things, Viola did not understand why the princess, who saved the life of the empress, had to flee. But Hani herself did not mind because her family was in the estate. In addition, the area where the estate is located was famous for its stunning scenery. Looking at the maid, the heroine had no idea what a shock Melissa had experienced from the betrayal of the nearest servant. When the carriage was ready, things were packed and the girls began to enter. Drake suddenly knocked on their door. The captain's face was darkened by horror, which caused both heroines to be stunned. First of all, he made sure that the little girl felt well, especially last night. Drake breathed a sigh of relief when he learned that after yesterday's meeting, Honey had safely returned to her room. To the horror of the princess, it turned out that last night, Fedora suddenly disappeared. She had been arrested as a suspect and was awaiting interrogation, but when she came to her in the morning, there was not even a trace of the servant. Now the search for the missing woman was in full swing, and since the last person she saw before being detained was Honey, Drake decided to come here. The Emperor even summoned Fedora's father because of this, suspecting that her family may have been involved in the escape. The little girl was sure that the maid had disappeared against her will, to which Drake sighed heavily. He also thought that the real customer had eliminated Fedora in order to hide the truth. After the conversation, the captain hurried to send the heroine to the estate, accompanied by the knights. The girl thought that this was exactly what Fedora was afraid of, or did she really just run away? When Hani arrived at the manor, he wondered what everyone was doing at such a late hour. Near the map, they were met by Charles, whom the heroine had not seen for a very long time and wanted to know where the others were. The head butler apologized for what he was going to say, and as it turned out, Mrs. Melissa had a miscarriage. Honey froze in place, her eyes rounded, and Viola covered her face with her hands in horror. It all happened very suddenly and very soon. His Highness was supposed to arrive here. Snatching her hand from Viola's palm, the girl rushed to the manor as fast as she could. But suddenly, the strength left the girl and she sat down on the road, being in deep despair. Charles personally accompanied the heroines into the house in an atmosphere of mourning silence. As they entered the room, they saw Agnes, Constance, Oswald, and Christopher standing by Melissa's bedside. The Empress lay with her eyes closed, and her eternally bright face was dull as ever. The Emperor's mother pushed Hani and Oswald closer to her, embracing them with her arms. The healer did everything she could, relieving the pain in the abdomen and eliminating the bleeding. Constance did not understand, because until recently Agnes had assured that everything was fine with Melissa and her grandson. However, a miscarriage could happen due to the emotions experienced, although there were cases when it occurred for no reason at all. The only thing the healer was sure of was that the poison had nothing to do with it.